Bloodborne is one of those games where the more you dig, the more you realise the surface barely hinted at what was actually going on beneath it. Welcome! This video is a long one, and that is entirely intentional. I put this together because Bloodborne's lore is the kind of thing that rewards slow, patient attention. There is so much crammed into item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental details that a rushed overview just does not do it justice. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to prioritise the smaller, stranger details over the big, obvious lore beats that most videos cover. So if you already know the basics of the Great Ones and the Healing Church, good, because we are going deeper than that. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The City Before the Hunt. Yharnam did not always look the way it does on the night of the hunt. The city we walk through in Bloodborne is a ruin of what it once was, and understanding what it used to be makes the whole tragedy land differently. The earliest versions of Yharnam were built around the Tomb of Eden, a massive underground labyrinth that predates almost everything else in the game. The city essentially grew upward from a burial site, which says a lot about what the people who founded it valued and what they were willing to build their civilization on top of. The Thumerian civilization came first. These were the people who originally excavated the old labyrinths beneath what would become Yharnam, and they had contact with the Great Ones long before any healing church ever existed. The Thumerians built elaborate tomb cities underground, and the remnants of their culture survive in the Chalice dungeons, which most players skip, but which contain some of the richest lore in the entire game. The Thumerians were not savages. They were sophisticated enough to develop their own rituals, their own hierarchy, and their own relationship with beings from outside human understanding. One reading of the Thumerian queens, particularly Yharnam herself, the Pumerian queen, who appears as a boss in the deepest Chalice dungeon, suggests that these women were essentially used as vessels. They were placed in proximity to Great Ones, and over generations, the Pthumerians developed a kind of reverence for the blood that resulted from that contact. This is where the idea of blood ministration originates, not in Victorian science or healing church theology, but in ancient underground rituals performed by people who had been doing this for centuries before Byrgenwerth ever sent scholars underground. The surface city of Yharnam came later. By the time the game takes place, the city above ground is layered over thousands of years of accumulated history, and most of its inhabitants have no real idea what is underneath them. The ordinary citizens of Yharnam, the ones hiding in their houses and shouting at you through locked doors, are living on top of a history they were never told about. That detail alone reframes a lot of how the Healing Church operated. They were not just a religious institution built on mystery. They were built on deliberately buried history. The architecture of Yharnam is worth paying attention to. The city has a distinct aesthetic that blends Victorian Gothic with something older and more Mediterranean, and that blend is not accidental. The Healing Church modelled parts of Yharnam on older structures, some of which reference the Pthumerian ruins below. There are columns and arches in the cathedral ward that echo the stonework you find in the deepest Chalice dungeons, and that connection suggests the church was aware of the aesthetic language of the civilization it was exploiting. They built their legitimacy in stone, literally referencing the ancient world they claimed authority over. The Healing Church workshop, which predates the schism that created the powder kegs and the choir and the school of Mensis, was originally the practical arm of the church. It was where hunters were trained, weapons were made, and the business of managing Yharnam's beast problem was handled. The workshop is now abandoned and deteriorating by the time the player arrives, which points toward how thoroughly the Healing Church moved away from its original purpose. What started as an institution that hunted beasts became something far more interested in transcendence than pest control. The hunt itself has a ritualistic quality that most players pick up on intuitively. Gascoigne performs it like a ceremony. The doll speaks of it with a kind of reverence, and the way the city is structured, with hunters moving through it in a specific sequence that almost mirrors a procession through a cathedral, suggests the hunt was always meant to be more than a practical exercise. One reading is that the hunt is itself a kind of offering. The blood, the violence, the transformation of hunters into something other than human, all of it may serve a purpose that the hunters themselves were never told about. Blood ministration is the cornerstone of Yharnam's culture and economy and religion all at once. The idea that blood from great ones or blood touched by them could cure disease attracted people from all over the world. Pilgrims came to Yharnam to be healed. The city grew wealthy on their desperation, and the healing church, which controlled access to the blood, became the most powerful institution in the region entirely because they held a monopoly on something people needed badly enough to travel across continents for. The player character arrives in Yharnam for exactly this reason. The opening of the game shows a transaction. You sign a contract, you receive a blood transfusion, and by morning, you're already infected with what the blood carries. The intro sequence is deliberately mundane in its framing. A clinic, a doctor, paperwork, and then the horror slides in so gradually that you almost do not notice the moment it takes over. That transition mirrors Yharnam's own history. Things did not go wrong all at once. They went wrong slowly, transaction by transaction, ritual by ritual. The cleric beast is the first major enemy in the game, and its significance is easy to underestimate if you're just trying to survive the encounter. The cleric beast was once a member of the healing church. A cleric, hence the name. It has transformed into something enormous and animalistic, retaining just enough of its original form to be recognizable as human if you look at the right angles. The fact that the game's first major boss is a failed holy man is not subtle, but it is effective. It tells you immediately what the healing church has done to its own people. The Udon tomb, which sits beneath the cathedral ward, is dedicated to a great one who has no physical form. Udon exists only in its voice, and in the blood it has touched. The tomb was built to house something that cannot be housed, which is a kind of theological absurdity that the healing church seems to have been perfectly comfortable with. Worshipping an entity that cannot be seen, touched, or fully understood fits with how the church operated generally. Legitimacy through mystery is a very old strategy. The Forbidden Wood sits on the edge of Yharnam and connects the city to Byrgenwerth, the university that started all of this. The woods are full of villagers who have been transformed through exposure to parasite-related experiments, which is distinct from the beast transformation caused by blood. These people have essentially become part plant, part human, and they exist in a kind of half-conscious state that is arguably worse than what happens to the beasts in the city. At least the beasts have momentum. The villagers in the woods are just waiting. Byrgenwerth itself is a fascinating ruin. It was once the premier institution of learning in the region, founded by a man named Master Philem, who is still there when you visit, sitting in a rocking chair by the lake, reduced to a near vegetable state by whatever he witnessed or tried to do. The university sent scholars into the Thumerian ruins, and what they found there changed everything. The discovery of eyes on the inside of the brain, which is how the game describes the process of gaining insight, drove several of the scholars to madness and drove the rest to obsession. Lawrence was a student at Byrgenwerth before he founded the Healing Church, and his relationship with Master Willem is one of the most important and underexplored dynamics in the game's history. They disagreed fundamentally about what to do with what they had found. Willem believed that evolution had to come from expanding consciousness, from gaining more eyes, more perspectives, more insight. Lawrence believed that the blood was the shortcut, that you could achieve transcendence through ministration, rather than through the slow, painful work of opening your mind. They split over this, and the split produced the healing church on one side and the continued research of Bjergenwerth on the other. The fishing hamlet is one of the most heartbreaking locations in the entire game, and it appears only in the Old Hunters DLC. This small coastal village was home to a community of fishermen who had made contact with a great one called Kos, or Cosm, who had washed up on their shore. The villagers incorporated Kos into their spiritual life in a way that was, by Bloodborne standards, relatively gentle. They did not try to exploit her. They did not extract her blood for commercial purposes. They just coexisted with something they did not understand. And that was enough for the healing church to send hunters to slaughter them all. The massacre of the fishing hamlet is one of the defining crimes in Bloodborne's lore. Bjergenwerth scholars, led by a man named Gehrman, raided the village, killed the inhabitants, and harvested the remains of Kos. The umbilical cord of the dead Great One was taken. Her body was left to rot, and the child she had been gestating, a parasitic Great One called the Orphan of Kos, was left to claw its way out of her corpse. The haunting and the nightmare of the hunter's nightmare is the direct result of this event. The villager's curse pulled hunters into that nightmare and trapped them there, which is a remarkably coherent piece of cosmological cause and effect for a game that communicates mostly through item descriptions. Gehrman's role in the fishing hamlet massacre reframes his entire character. He appears at the beginning of the game as a mentor figure, an old man in a wheelchair who gives you guidance and who, at the end of the game, offers to end your dream. He is presented as a tragic figure, trapped in the hunter's dream against his will. And all of that is true. But he is also the man who led a genocide against a coastal village that had done nothing wrong, and the game does not let you forget that if you look for it. The hunter's dream itself is a constructed space. It was made by the Moon Presence, a Great One who entered into an agreement with Gehrman and who uses the dream as a way to produce hunters. The nature of this agreement is not fully clear, but one reading is that Gehrman, traumatized by his experiences and possibly by the consequences of what happened at the fishing hamlet, made some kind of bargain that resulted in the dream being established. He became its caretaker. The doll was made in the image of a woman he loved or was obsessed with. And the whole structure is a trap, comfortable and helpful on the surface, deeply sinister underneath. The doll is made in the likeness of Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Maria was one of Gehrman's students, one of the first hunters he trained, and she was also present at the fishing hamlet. Unlike Gehrman, she was apparently so horrified by what happened there that she abandoned her weapons and sealed herself in the clock tower, refusing to hunt anymore. She eventually killed herself, though the dream version of her continues to exist as a ghost. The fact that Gehrman built a doll in her image suggests the weight of whatever their relationship was, and the weight of what she did and what he could not undo. The Great Ones are not gods in the traditional sense, though Yharnam's religion treats them that way. They are something more like an evolutionary endpoint, beings of pure thought and expanded consciousness who exist on a different plane of experience than humans. Contact with them is transformative, often catastrophically so, because the human mind is not built to process what they represent. The insight mechanic in the game is a literal measurement of how much exposure to their reality a character has had, and it has tangible effects on what you can see and hear and how enemies perceive you. Hunter's tools, which are the game's equivalent of magic spells, all draw on the power of Great Ones in some form. The choir bell, the augur of Ebrietas, the call beyond, these are not wizardry in a fantasy sense. They are ways of briefly channeling energies from beings that exist beyond normal human comprehension. The fact that they are classified as weapons, things used for fighting, says something about how the healing church ultimately approached the Great Ones. Even transcendence was instrumentalized. The School of Mensis is the faction that is most directly responsible for the state of Yharnam on the night of the hunt. They are the ones who conducted the ritual that invited Murgo's wet nurse, who caused the spreading of the nightmare, who essentially broke the already fragile equilibrium of the city. The School of Mensis was a splinter of the healing church that became convinced that direct contact with a Great One was the path to ultimate power, and they were not wrong exactly, but the price they paid was that their entire leadership was reduced to brain-dead husks, their consciousnesses uploaded into a brain in a jar and exposed to Murgo, a Great One infant, in the nightmare realm. The wet nurse who attends Murgo is one of the most visually striking bosses in the game, a multi-armed figure draped in black who fights you while Murgo cries. Murgo itself is never seen, only heard. The crying of an infant Great One is the source of the nightmare, spreading through Yharnam, and the moon presence wants you to silence it. Though whether this is for benevolent reasons or purely self-interested ones is something the game leaves open. Murgo is described as stillborn, which adds a layer of tragedy to everything. The infant at the centre of the nightmare, the one whose crying is tearing the city apart, may already be dead. The wet nurse may be attending a ghost. The whole nightmare may be sustained by the echo of a being that never truly lived, which fits with the game's broader meditation on what happens when you reach for something beyond your grasp. The choir is the uppermost branch of the healing church and occupies the upper cathedral ward. They went further than other factions in their contact with Great Ones, specifically with Ebrietas, daughter of the Cosmos, who is a Great One who was left behind when the others ascended. Ebrietas agreed, or at least did not resist, being kept in the upper cathedral and essentially studied and communed with. The choir believed that through prolonged contact with Ebrietas, they could achieve the same kind of transcendence the Thumerians once reached for. Whether they got there is debatable. What is not debatable is that by the time you reach the upper ward, it is full of enemies who have been transformed beyond recognition. The orphans the choir created, the celestial children in white who wander the upper ward, are one of the sadder enemy types in the game. They are the result of experiments intended to produce beings that could commune more easily with Great Ones, children whose development was influenced by exposure to the blood of Ebrietas. They are docile until provoked, which suggests they were not violent by nature. Something happened to them, something made them dangerous, but you can hear in their behaviour something that was once just a child. The Executioners are a faction that predates the Healing Church's more esoteric ambitions. They were founded by a figure called Logarius, and were responsible for hunting those who worshipped the vile blood, a type of blood associated with Queen Annalise of Cainhurst. The vile bloods were considered heretics by the Church because their blood came from a different source than the Church-sanctioned blood, and because Annalise claimed that her blood could make her immortal. Whether she was right is suggested by the fact that she is still alive when you meet her, seated on her throne in the ruined castle of Cainhurst. Cainhurst is one of the most visually distinctive locations in the game. It is a castle covered in snow, accessible only by a stagecoach that appears in response to a specific invitation, and it is populated by the ghosts of the aristocracy that once lived there. The vile bloods who remain are wraiths and spirits, people who were slaughtered by Logarius and his executioners, and whose blood-soaked history keeps them anchored to the place. The whole location has a gothic romance quality that is distinct from the rest of Yharnam's body horror, and it says something about the range of Bloodborne's aesthetic that it can contain both. Logarius himself is found on the roof of Cainhurst, having devoted himself to sitting on top of Annalise's hiding place and preventing anyone from reaching her. He has been there so long, he has become something other than human, whether from the efforts or from exposure to the environment or from something else entirely. His boss fight has a theatrical quality, an old man in ceremonial armour fighting with blood magic and sky rituals that suggests he was once genuinely impressive. What he became by the time you reach him is a desperate measure wearing the costume of grandeur. Alfred is a hunter who follows the executioner tradition and is obsessed with completing what Logarius started. He is friendly and helpful to the player early on, giving information and assistance with what seems like genuine warmth. Then you find out what he does to Annalise if you give him the unopened summons. The invitation to Canehurst, he goes there, kills her, dismembers her, laughs, and then sits down in the entrance of the castle to die. The shift from helpful companion to fanatical murderer is not subtle, but it is a very clean demonstration of what religious conviction can do to a person. Alfred was always like this. You just did not know it yet. Annalise can be reconstituted at the altar in Canehurst even after Alfred destroys her, which supports her claim of immortality. She simply comes back together. She remains seated on her throne, and she continues her project of collecting vile blood, a project with no clear endpoint. What she is actually working toward, whether there is an end game to her accumulation of blood, is not spelled out. One reading is that she genuinely believes she can use the vile blood to ascend in some way. Another is that she has simply been alive so long that the project is more habit than purpose. The Forbidden Woods village connects to an entirely different strand of horror. The snake parasites that have infected the villagers there are related to the research of a church scholar who believed that a different kind of unity with the cosmos could be achieved through merging human consciousness with a hive organism. The snakes that burst from the heads and bodies of the villagers are not just a gross visual. They are the result of a coherent, if catastrophically wrong, theory about transcendence. Someone looked at what the church was doing with blood and thought, what if we tried a different kind of merger entirely? The connection between the Forbidden Woods and Byrgenwerth, established by the river and the physical path between them, is a reminder that the healing church never fully severed its roots. The scholars who went into the woods were still operating in the tradition of Byrgenwerth, still trying to answer the same questions. They just took the research in a direction that Willem and Lawrence would not have endorsed, or at least that is one reading. Another is that the church knew exactly what was happening in the woods and allowed it because the experiments produced data they found useful. The Pithumerian descendant, one of the bosses you can encounter in the Chalice dungeons, moves with a speed and precision that nothing else in the game quite matches. The fight communicates something through its mechanics, that the Pithumerians developed combat traditions that were refined over centuries of living underground alongside genuinely dangerous things. They were not just passive custodians of the old blood, they were a warrior culture that maintained the labyrinths through force as much as ritual. The bloodletting beast, another Chalice dungeon boss, is a creature so far advanced in beast transformation that it no longer resembles its original form at all. When you sever its head during the fight, the body continues fighting using a parasite that emerges from the neck stump. This detail, the parasite hidden inside the beast, connects to the broader theme of infestation that runs through the game. Beneath the obvious transformation is always something else, something smaller and more fundamental doing the actual work. The blood in Bloodborne is almost a character in itself. It carries memory. It carries transformation. It carries the traces of every consciousness that has ever passed through the Pthumerians, the Healing Church, the scholars of Byrgenwerth, and eventually the Hunters. When you consume blood echoes to level up, you are literally absorbing the accumulated experience of everything that bled in Yharnam. The game mechanizes something that its lore makes deeply strange, and that strangeness is part of what makes the whole system feel coherent. The Hunter's Nightmare is described as a place where hunters who could not bear the weight of what they had done are sent to hunt forever. It is a punishment and a trap, but it is also, in a way, exactly what the hunters who end up there will choose to do anyway. They cannot stop hunting. It is what they are. The nightmare just removes the pretense that there is anything else. Simon the Harrowed, one of the NPCs you meet in the DLC, went to the nightmare voluntarily to find a way to end it, and has been trapped there ever since. His goal was mercy. His method was also hunting. The game does not comment on the irony, but it is there. Ludwig the Holy Blade is the founder of the Church Hunters, the ones who came after Gehrman's original hunter workshop tradition. He established a more organized approach to hunting, with a chain of command and a specific aesthetic: the holy moonlight sword, the white church attire, the sense of crusade rather than craft. In the Nightmare, you find him transformed into a beast, crawling through a tunnel, enormous and broken, still clutching his horse. When you damage him enough, he recovers something, remembers something, reaches for his sword, and the fight changes completely. The moment of recognition in Ludwig's fight is one of the most affecting things in the game. He comes back to himself just long enough to fight with dignity, and then you have to kill him anyway. Lady Maria's fight in the Astral Clock Tower is the DLC's emotional centerpiece. She does not want to be found. She does not want to fight. She's been sitting in that room for what may be a very long time, having chosen stillness over continued participation in what the church was doing. When you wake her up, she is angry in a way that feels personal. Not the mindless aggression of a beast, but the anger of someone who made a private decision and resents being dragged back into a world she renounced. The fight escalates through 3 phases, and each one feels like she's escalating her willingness to hurt you, like she's working past her own reluctance. The Astral Clock Tower itself is a strange location. It sits above the research hall, which was a healing church facility where live subjects were given experimental eye treatments and kept in controlled conditions. The patients in the research hall are suffering. The living failures, the beings who float above the hall and scream, are the results of experiments that did not produce the intended transcendence. The clock tower is supposed to be separate from all of that, Maria's refuge, and the fact that it sits directly above the worst of what the church did to people feels like the game making a point about the impossibility of clean hands in a corrupt institution. The music box that Eileen gives you if you meet her, and the music box that the young girl asks you to deliver to her father, Gascoigne, are the same music box. It plays a lullaby. Gascoigne, in his beast state, reacts to it, because some part of him still recognizes it. The item description tells you that it was a gift from his wife to their daughters. By the time you use it in the fight, his wife is already dead, killed by Gascoigne in the early stages of his transformation, and his daughters are waiting in different parts of the city. Whether they survive the night depends on choices you make, and none of the outcomes are good. The music box appears twice in the game, and both times its function is to briefly remind a monster that it used to be a person. That is a lot of work for a small item. The celestial emissary is technically a great one, or at least a being in proximity to one, but it is perhaps the least threatening great one encounter in the game. It is a cluster of small blue aliens who combine into a slightly larger blue alien for the second phase. It feels almost anticlimactic after everything the game builds up around the idea of encountering a great one. One reading is that the celestial emissary is meant to demonstrate the gap between what the church promised, transcendence through contact with divine beings, and what contact actually looks like in practice. The great ones are not majestic on command. Sometimes you get a pile of small blue things that die to a charged attack. The wet nurse's feathers raise an interesting question. The enemy design for Murgo's wet nurse, with its black-feathered wings and multi-armed silhouette, does not obviously match the design language of any other great one in the game. Most great ones have a visual logic tied to eyes, tentacles, the sea, the cosmos. The wet nurse is more avian, more terrestrial, mythological in its reference points. This might be a deliberate choice to make it feel alien, even within the alien ecology of the great ones. Or it might suggest something about Murgo's nature that the game does not directly address. The wet nurse is defined entirely by its function. It attends the child. Whatever it is beyond that, the game does not say. The moon presence is the entity behind the hunter's dream, and arguably the final antagonist of the game's base story. though it never overtly threatens you until the endgame. It uses the dream as a farm, producing hunters who go into Yharnam and thin the population of beasts, and generally manage the situation on its behalf. Whether it does this for reasons that are coherent from a human perspective is unclear. One reading is that the moon presence is maintaining some kind of balance, keeping the situation from escalating to a point where it becomes unmanageable. Another is that it simply likes hunters, and hunting the way humans like certain animals, decoratively and with complete indifference to the preferences of the thing being kept. The plain doll says one thing that sticks: "Dear hunter, it is enough for me to be here for you." She is a constructed being made to serve a function in a dream manufactured by a cosmic entity. She cannot leave. She has no life outside of the moments you return to her. And she has arrived at something like peace with that, which is either beautiful or devastating, depending on how you look at it. She was made to be content with her situation. Does that make her contentment less real? The game does not answer that. It just leaves her there, tending the workshop, waiting. Chapter 2. The blood and what it does. The transformation that blood ministration causes in Yharnam is not random mutation. There is a structure to it, a progression, and understanding that progression helps clarify why some characters in the game are where they are in their transformation, and what might have been done at different points to slow or reverse it. The bestial transformation that turns the citizens of Yharnam into the creatures you fight appears to be driven by the volume and concentration of blood consumed, but also by something more psychological: the degree to which a person surrenders to what the blood offers. The term pale blood appears once in the game, in the very first line of the opening cinematic. Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. It is never explained. It never appears in an item description in a way that satisfies the question. This is either a deliberate piece of mystery or the most significant piece of unexplained lore in the game, depending on who you ask. One reading is that pale blood refers to the moon presence itself, which appears pale against the red moon during the endgame. Another is that pale blood is what the player character has, a blood type that makes them uniquely able to move through the hunt without fully succumbing to it. The ambiguity is almost certainly intentional. From Software, games tend to treat unanswered questions as features. The beasts of Yharnam are not all the same. There is a meaningful taxonomy to them, and paying attention to it tells you something about what different parts of the city were and who lived there. The cleric beasts are large and canine, and they tend to appear in areas associated with the church. The scourge beasts are more wolf-like and appear throughout the lower city. The church giants are enormous and slow, possibly the result of experiments on subjects who were already physically large. Each enemy type carries residual identity from what it was before, and if you look at them with that in mind, the city starts to feel like a record of itself. The Bloodborne trick weapons are themselves an expression of hunter philosophy. The saw cleaver, the starting weapon for most players, is designed to tear into beast flesh, to create wounds that bleed heavily. The blood the beast loses is actually harmful to the beast in some game lore frameworks, because the blood is what is maintaining their frenzy, and losing it destabilizes them. The weapons are engineered around this. They are not just swords and axes. They are tools specifically designed to exploit the biology of the enemy, which suggests a very detailed and practiced understanding of how beast transformation works at a physiological level. The old hunter set, the armour that comes from Gehrman's era, is described as smelling of beast blood even after thorough cleaning. The implication is that hunters who hunted long enough were so thoroughly soaked in beast blood that it became part of them, that the smell worked into the fibres of the material permanently. This is a detail that lands differently once you understand that beast blood is not neutral. Prolonged exposure to it, including through the skin, through breathing it in, through the constant proximity required for the close quarters combat of hunting, would have effects. The hunters were not immune to what they were fighting. They were just at an earlier stage. The old blood, which is the term for the particularly ancient and potent blood found in the deepest chalice dungeons, is described as having effects even in its stored form. Items associated with it have a quality of wrongness. The dungeons where it's found are structured differently from the city above. More ancient, more deliberate, more clearly designed by people who understood what they were working with. The old blood is the direct source material for everything the Healing Church built, and the fact that it still exists in its original form in the dungeons beneath the city suggests that whatever the church tapped into, they tapped into only a fraction of it. Adela the Nun is one of the NPCs who can appear in your playthrough if you follow a specific set of actions, and her story is a small, contained tragedy. She is a blood saint, someone designated by the church for their ability to produce particularly pure blood that can be used in certain rituals. She is frightened, not particularly knowledgeable about the larger events of the night, and dependent on the player's choices for her survival. If you send her to Yosefka's clinic, she ends up transformed into a celestial mob, indistinguishable from the other failed experiments there. If you keep her with Ariana, complications arise. There is no clean outcome for Adela because the game is not interested in clean outcomes. People like her, caught in the machinery of the church's projects without real understanding or power, tend to get ground up by it. Ariana, the woman of pleasure, who lives on the Cathedral Ward Road, is one of the few characters who can survive the night under the right conditions and who can produce an umbilical cord, one of the items needed to unlock the true ending. The cord she produces suggests she has Canehurst blood in her heritage, which connects her to the vile blood lineage and to Annalise's project. Her survival and the thing she gives birth to are details the game presents without comment. She sits in the sewers below Yosefka's clinic, having given birth to something she cannot look at, and the game does not ask you to process that on her behalf. It just leaves it there. The umbilical cords are one of the game's most significant item types, and also one of its most thematically strange. They are relics of contact between humans and great ones, physical records of a pregnancy that cross the boundary between human and cosmic. There are 3 you can collect in the base game, and a 4th implied in the DLC. Each one belonged to a different relationship, a different attempt at connection between species, and each one is described in language that blends the clinical with the reverential. Consuming them grants insight and, at the end of the game, enables you to confront the moon presence. The act of consuming them is presented as a ritual, not just a game mechanic. Murgo's cord, which is held by Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, in the deepest chalice dungeon, suggests that the stillborn Great One's origin lies with the Pthumerian civilization. The queen is a boss at the very bottom of the Ithil tomb, the deepest accessible dungeon, and she is pregnant, or appears to have been pregnant, with Murgo. The connection between the ancient Pthumerian civilization and the Great One crying at the centre of the nightmare is a thread that runs through the entire depth of the game's lore and connects the oldest history of the world with the immediate crisis happening above. The Winter Lanterns are among the most mechanically threatening and lore-rich enemies in the game. They are hunter-derived beings, still wearing scraps of hunter gear, who have transformed so completely that their heads are now clusters of eyes and mouths. The frenzy build-up they cause is represented as a kind of psychic assault. Getting too close to a winter lantern, especially when it is humming, is supposed to represent the experience of having your mind overwhelmed by something it cannot process. They are what insight, taken too far, might actually produce. A creature with too many eyes and not enough left of the self that used to use them. The watchdog of the Old Lords is a boss that exists only in the Chalice dungeons and is described as one of the beasts that was present in the old Pthumerian civilization. It is a colossal, wolf-like creature that breathes fire, and its existence in the dungeons implies that the bestial transformation was not something the healing church created. It predates the church by centuries. The Pthumerians dealt with beasts too, managed them, possibly worshipped them in some contexts. The church did not invent the problem of beast transformation. They inherited it and then made it dramatically worse through scale. The brainsucker enemy type is one of the clearest visual representations of what insight corruption looks like. They were once people, or possibly hunters, who gained too much insight and lost their human form in the process. Their heads are clusters of brain and eye matter, and their primary attack is a grab that removes insight from you, which is to say, they literally steal your accumulated knowledge of the cosmic. Whether this is a survival mechanism, an instinctive behavior, or something deliberate is not stated. But the idea that a creature defined by too much insight would hunger for more of it is coherent in a dark way. The blood of Adeline, which you receive from Adeline in the research hall after completing her questline, is described as a particularly refined form of brain fluid, altered by experimentation. Adeline is one of the research hall patients who was given repeated eye treatments as part of a church experiment to induce the kind of third eye that some great ones possess. She succeeds at terrible cost, and what she asks for in return for completing her arc is more of the substance that she was given during the experiments. She's become dependent on the thing that was destroying her. Her arc is quiet and sad, and ends without resolution, which is fitting for Bloodborne. The formless Uden is described throughout the game in a way that emphasizes what it lacks, rather than what it has. No body, no form, no voice of its own, only presence. The chalice ritual items associated with Uden reference its nature as a being of pure sound and breath and blood. The worshippers of Eden in the game, most notably the Uden Chapel Dweller, are people who sought connection with a being that cannot truly be perceived. The Dweller maintains the chapel, keeps it as a sanctuary, and seems to have a relationship with Odin that is both sincere and impossible to verify. He cannot prove the Great One hears him. He maintains the space anyway. The Blood Dreg, an item associated with the Vile Blood Covenant, is described as a remnant of the female instinct that lingers in blood. Annalise collects them. What she uses them for is not stated. The connection between blood and reproduction runs through the game's lore in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes explicit, and the Vile Blood's specific association with female instinct in their blood connects to broader themes about Great Ones, pregnancy, birth, and what it means to carry something beyond human understanding inside a human body. The Madman's knowledge items, which you find throughout the game, and which grant insight when consumed, are described as fragments of something, residue from minds that encountered the cosmos and were broken by it. They look like flowers or brain matter, or some combination of both. The fact that insight, the currency of expanded consciousness, is obtained by consuming the remains of people who went mad from expanded consciousness is a loop that the game presents without irony. You are building yourself up with the wreckage of the people who are not strong enough to survive the process. The numbing mist item, which temporarily prevents a human NPC from regaining health through blood, is one of several items that suggest the game's world has developed a surprisingly sophisticated pharmacological relationship with blood as medicine. The fact that a mist can interrupt blood healing implies an understanding of how blood administration works, at a chemical level that goes beyond simple faith. The healing church's power was always presented as religious, but underneath it was always also medical and scientific, and the two frameworks coexisted in a way that is specific to Yharnam and makes it distinct from generic fantasy religion settings. The Eye Rune, which belongs to the Hunter Rune category and grants additional item discovery, is described as representing the eye that perceives things beyond normal sight. The rune system in Bloodborne is derived from Carol, a student of Bergenwerth, who had the ability to hear the murmuring of great ones and transcribe it into symbols. The runes you equip are, in a sense, fragments of the Great One's communication, inscribed by someone who could hear them and had the presence of mind to write them down, rather than simply be destroyed by the experience. Carol's work is one of the most unusual occupations in the game's world, an academic who listened to gods and took notes. The kin of the cosmos, which is how the game categorizes certain enemies, including the celestial emissary and ebrietas, are technically less vulnerable to fire and more vulnerable to bolt and arcane damage. This is mechanically relevant but also lore relevant. Fire is a terrestrial element associated with humanity, with the beasts. Kin of the cosmos are not beasts. They are something else, something that responds differently to the tools humans develop to manage the bestial transformation. The game's damage system is also a taxonomy of what kinds of things exist in the world and how they relate to the elements humans have learned to weaponize. The clawmark rune, which strengthens visceral attacks, suggests something about how hunters develop over time. Visceral attacks in Bloodborne are brutal, up-close executions that require precise timing and counter-pressure against an enemy's momentum. Strengthening them further through a rune that resembles claw marks implies a development towards something more instinctive, more bestial in the hunter's combat style. The tools you use to become a better hunter are nudging you toward the thing you're supposed to be fighting. The clawmark rune is the game suggesting quietly that there is no clean side of this conflict. The hunter's mark, the item you use to return to the dream, is described as a symbol of the hunt. It burns the hunter's mark into the flesh, and using it sets a hunter on fire momentarily before pulling them out of the waking world. The image of a hunter on fire consumed briefly before vanishing is almost too on the nose as a metaphor, but it is also just the practical texture of how the hunt works in this world. Hunters moving between waking and dream on a mark that burns them slightly every time they use it, accumulating small hurts in the service of the larger project. The delayed Molotov and the oil urn, the combination of which is one of the game's most reliable crowd control strategies, are described in terms that ground them in the practical economics of Yharnam. They are not enchanted weapons, they are street-level tools, the kind of thing you would make in a workshop from materials available in a 19th century city. The fact that fire works so well against the beasts of Yharnam suggests that whatever the bestial transformation does to a person's body, it makes them physically combustible in ways they were not before. The beast condition, among its other qualities, makes you flammable. That is the kind of detail that sounds like it should be played for comedy, and instead just deepens the horror. The Gascoigne fight uses the music box so specifically and so well because it is one of the only moments in the game where you can observe, in real time, a transformation that has already happened being briefly interrupted. Gascoigne in his beast state is enormous and aggressive and makes no sounds that resemble human speech. Then the music box plays, and he freezes, he crouches, he makes a sound. And then the beast takes back over. That pause, those seconds, are the game showing you that the thing inside the beast is still there. It has not left. It is just not in control anymore. That is worse than if it were gone. The moon rune, the covenant item for the Cainhurst Covenant, is described as a rune that resonates with the inhuman will of Annalise. The idea that a rune can be derived from a person rather than a great one suggests that the line between human and something else was always more permeable than the Church's official theology admitted. Annalise, through whatever the vile blood has done to her over centuries, has become something that can generate a Carol rune. She has become a source, not just a worshipper. What that means for her eventual trajectory, if she has one, is one of the game's open questions. Iosefka's clinic is the first building you enter in the game, and one of the most important locations for understanding what the healing church actually did to people. The real Iosefka runs the clinic early in the game, treating patients and asking you to send people to her for safety. somewhere in the middle of the night, she is replaced, possibly willingly, possibly not, by an imposter who is actually a choir member conducting experiments on the patients the player has been sending there. The transformation of the clinic from refuge to laboratory happens while you're not looking, and the bodies of the patients are there when you return. The real Yosefka may have known what was coming. The game does not say. The living string, the most potent ritual material for Chalice dungeons, is described as the brain of a long-dead Great One, which still squirms. It is used to open the deepest and most dangerous dungeons, the ones where the oldest blood is found. The image of a dead god's brain, still alive in some sense, still responsive to ritual, still useful for unlocking things that should probably stay locked, is one of the game's densest pieces of lore compressed into an item description. You're using the remnant of a dead cosmic entity as a key. That is where the game takes you if you go far enough down. The great deep-sea runes, which reduce damage from certain sources and are found in the depths of Chalice dungeons, are associated with the formless sea and with the deep unknowing of the ocean floor. They suggest that the Great Ones are not just cosmic in the astronomical sense, stars and moons and voids, but also oceanic in the way that deep water is cosmic in its own way, something incomprehensibly large and pressurized and dark. The sea imagery in Bloodborne, Kos on the shore, the fishing hamlet, the deep sea runes, the way certain Great One designs reference marine life, is a consistent aesthetic choice that grounds the impossible in something physically real, the experience of the deep ocean, which is as close as most people will get to the genuinely unknowable. The guidance rune, one of the hunter rune options, is described as a rune of the old hunters, one that has been passed down through generations. The idea that runes can be traditional, handed down like techniques or songs, suggests a hunter culture with real depth, not just a series of desperate individuals improvising solutions, but a community with shared knowledge and institutional memory. That community has been almost entirely destroyed by the time the game takes place, leaving only the broken remnants visible in the NPCs you meet and the items you find. But the runes themselves are the memory of it, still transmissible, still functional long after the people who developed them are gone. The Hunter's Oath, rune, the covenant rune for the League, is associated with Valter, Master of the League, a hunter who ate a centipede-like creature that he pulled from inside another hunter's body, and who has since seen the vermin everywhere, infesting everyone. The League's covenant is built around hunting these vermin that only certain people can see, and Valter believes that the ability to see them is a mark of moral clarity. Whether the vermin are real, a shared delusion, an insight-adjacent phenomenon, or something that exists on a plane the player character's default perception cannot access, is never resolved. The game takes Valter seriously without confirming his worldview. The vermin itself, the item you collect by hunting with Valter's cooperation, is described in terms that are deliberately ambiguous about its physical reality. It is small, it is dark, and it squirms. That description would also apply to several things in the game that are definitely real. The fact that you can hold it in your hand, examine it, and trade it back to Valter for rewards suggests it has some physical existence. But the broader covenant is built around a perception that not everyone shares, and the game does not break the ambiguity. The Spark Hunter badge and the Firing Hammer badge, found on the bodies of specific hunters in the game world, represent hunters who specialized in particular styles that required access to specific tools. The badges exist because the church required formal credentialing for hunters to access the workshop's resources. There was a bureaucracy to it. You needed the right badge to buy the right bullets. The overlay of institutional structure on top of something as wild and desperate as a hunt night is one of the game's subtler comedies, a world that developed paperwork for monster killing. The Bloodrock item, which fully upgrades a weapon at the cost of being extremely rare, is described as a pebble of unknown origin found in burial grounds. Its effect on weapons, bringing them to maximum potential, is presented as a mystery. The rock does something to metal that conventional upgrading cannot, and the fact that it comes from burial grounds ties it to the same world of ancient death and stored power that runs through everything else. In Bloodborne, the most powerful upgrade material is literally something you dig up from graves. The Beast Claw weapon, which can be infused with a specific rune to put the character into a full beast mode, where they move on all fours and have dramatically different attack animations, is one of the most direct expressions of the game's central tension. You are a hunter. You fight beasts. You can choose to become a beast to fight better. The rune required to unlock the full beast transformation is called Beast, and it is found by defeating a specific boss in a chalice dungeon, which means you have to go deep into the history of what the beast condition is before you can fully embrace it. The game makes you earn the understanding before it lets you make the choice. The Burial Blade, Gehrman's weapon, and the first weapon available if you are in New Game Plus, is a curved sword attached to a scythe that can be extended for range. It is described as a weapon that was made for a different age of hunting, before the church formalized things, when hunters had to be more improvisational. Gehrman made it himself, or had it made, and it carries the specific quality of something designed by someone who understood what they were up against. It is also, by the end of the game, the weapon that Gehrman uses to try to kill you so he can release you from the dream. He uses his oldest tool for his most personal act. That detail is not accidental. The Chikag, the katana associated with the Cainhurst Covenant and with vile blood, transforms from a normal sword into a blood-coated weapon that deals more damage at the cost of slowly draining your own health. This mechanic captures something essential about the vile blood philosophy. Power through blood, even your own, even when it hurts you, even when the thing you're drawing from is you. Rakuyo, the other Cainhurst adjacent weapon found in the DLC, is described as belonging to Lady Maria and is made from a material found only in the fishing hamlet. Maria carried a weapon from the place whose people she helped destroy. The game hides that detail in a place most players do not look, but it is there. Chapter 3: The Hunters and What They Became. Gehrman is simultaneously the most important and the most opaque character in Bloodborne. He appears early, seems helpful, gives you access to the workshop's resources, and is present at nearly every major transition in the game's progression. By the end, you understand that he has been there for a very long time, that his presence in the dream is involuntary, that the figure of wisdom and mentorship has been a prisoner who chose to make the best of his captivity. But understanding why he was imprisoned requires going to places and reading items that most players will not find on a first playthrough. The first hunters, Gehrman's original cohort, predated everything the Healing Church built. They operated in a Yharnam that was beginning to see the first consequences of blood ministration, but had not yet fully understood what it had started. These hunters were improvising. They had no playbook, no tradition, no established technique for what beast hunting required. Gehrman's genius, if it can be called that, was in systematizing something that was chaotic. He developed the trick weapon concept, the rally system, the general approach that subsequent hunter traditions would build on and bureaucratize into the church workshop. Maria was the second generation. She trained under Gehrman, adopted his methods, and took them to a level of technical refinement that may have exceeded the original. The description of her boss fight emphasizes her speed, her precision, her unwillingness to use underhanded techniques. She is a purist, which makes her participation in the fishing hamlet massacre all the more ironic. Whatever she believed about the proper conduct of hunting did not prevent her from participating in one of the most clearly wrong things the hunters ever did. The tension between her ethical self-image and what she actually did drove her to sealing herself away, and eventually to self-destruction. Simon the Harrowed, the NPC you meet in The Hunter's Nightmare, is a hunter who went to the nightmare voluntarily. He learned about the nightmare, understood that hunters were being trapped there, and chose to go in with the goal of finding a way to release them or end the nightmare. He has been trapped there long enough to become harrowed in the way the game uses the word. Worn down, darkened, but not broken, he still has his goal. He helps the player because he recognizes that the player is moving in a direction that aligns with what he's trying to do, even if they have different reasons for doing it. His death, if you encounter it, is quiet and without ceremony, which feels right for the kind of character he is. Eileen the Crow is a hunter who hunts hunters. This is presented as a specific specialization, a response to the fact that hunters, over time, tend to lose themselves to the hunt and become something dangerous to ordinary people rather than protective of them. Eileen's role is to manage that, to remove hunters who have gone too far before they become an active threat. She is old. The game communicates this through her movement and her dialogue. She's been doing this a long time. By the night of the hunt, she is struggling. Her questline, if you follow it correctly, involves helping her complete what she set out to do. If you do not, you find her dying in front of the Grand Cathedral. Having been attacked by a hunter she could not manage alone. Jura is one of the hunters you encounter in Old Yharnam who has made a different choice from most. He has stopped hunting beasts and has instead taken a protective stance toward them, reasoning that the beasts are still people, still suffering, and that killing them without mercy is no different from any other atrocity the city has perpetrated. He fires on you from his Gatling gun position when you enter Old Yharnam because you are, from his perspective, just another hunter, come to slaughter the helpless. His position can be reached through dialogue if you make specific choices, but only after demonstrating that you're not simply a killing machine. His arc is one of the most morally complex in the game. A character who was in the right about something and who became isolated and embittered by being right. Old Yharnam itself is significant because it represents an earlier outbreak, a previous hunt night that did not resolve cleanly. The church burned it. Old Yharnam is a charred ruin beneath the main city, visible from certain vantage points as a smouldering layer below the current streets. The decision to burn a district of the city with its inhabitants still in it, in order to contain a beast outbreak, is the kind of choice the church made quietly and then built over. Yharnam's history is partly a history of successive cover-ups, each one building on the last, each one requiring more extraordinary measures than the one before. The powder kegs were a splinter group of the Healing Church workshop who believed that the standard weapons of hunters were insufficient for the scale of the beast problem. They developed explosive and mechanical weapons, the cannon, the rifle spear, the stake driver, inventions that the more conservative workshop found excessive and borderline heretical. They were eventually expelled from the workshop for their approach and continued their work independently, producing the most unusual weapons available in the game. The powder keg's philosophy was essentially that if the beasts have escalated beyond what conventional weapons can handle, you escalate your weapons past what conventionality recommends. They were not wrong. The Gatling gun that Jura uses from his tower is a powder keg weapon. He was a member of the faction before his disillusionment. The detail that one of the game's most morally serious characters came from the most extreme weapons faction and ended up in a position of radical pacifism toward beasts is one of those background connections that rewards attention. Jura went from building bigger weapons to refusing to use any weapon against the creatures he once hunted. Whatever he witnessed in his hunting career was enough to make him reverse course entirely. Alfred's weapons, the church pick and the kirkhammer, are both Healing Church workshop weapons that communicate something about his identity. The kirkhammer transforms from a small silver sword into an enormous stone warhammer, which captures the church's dual nature, refined and ceremonial on the surface, massive and crushing underneath. Alfred is exactly like this, helpful and warm on the outside, an enormous capacity for violence underneath. His final action in the game, if you follow his questline to completion, is to reduce Annalise to pieces, with the Kirkhammer laughing as he does it. The weapon was always telling you something about him. The saw weapons, the saw cleaver, and the saw spear are the most explicitly engineered for hunting weapons in the game. They unfold to reveal serrated edges, specifically designed to maximize blood loss in beast-type enemies. The description of what these weapons are designed to do in practical terms is clinical in a way that makes it worse. Someone sat down and worked out the most effective way to make a beast bleed out quickly, and the result was a popular weapon that most beginning hunters used as their standard kit. The efficiency is disturbing once you think about it from the direction of what is being made to bleed. The threaded cane is the other starting weapon option, and it communicates a different kind of hunter. It transforms from a cane into a whip, and it is associated in its design with a more aristocratic tradition of hunting, something closer to sport than labour. The cane in its untransformed state is a social artifact. Carrying it communicates class and status. The fact that it unfolds into a weapon that can strike at range and deal salting damage is the game acknowledging that in Yharnam, class is armour, except when it is not. Hunter Henriette, who appears in co-op Phantoms and whose armour can be found in the game, is one of the few female hunters who is specifically named and whose equipment can be examined. The Hunter of Hunters set she wears is designed for mobility and concealment, which fits with Eileen's tradition. The lineage of Hunters is not just a job title, it is a craft, with specific equipment developed for the specific requirements of hunting prey that is also a hunter. The fact that multiple people have held this role, and that their equipment has been refined across generations, suggests a tradition that developed in parallel with the main hunter lineage, and in response to its predictable failures. Valter's crowfeather armour, which the player inherits if they complete the League questline, has a specific quality to it that is both protective and unsettling. The feathers used in the armour construction are associated with hunters who have developed a particular kind of perception, the ability to see the vermin that Valter believes infest everything. Wearing the armour is, in a sense, adopting an aspect of Valter's worldview. The game does not require you to believe in the vermin to equip the armour, but equipping the armour and then hunting, as Valter asks you to do, is participation in his project, regardless of what you believe about its metaphysical basis. The Graveguard mask and the associated set are found on a grave near Canehurst and suggest a class of church-adjacent figures who were tasked with managing the dead rather than the living. Yharnam produces a lot of dead, and the management of those dead, the burial, the rites, the prevention of the dead from becoming mobile problems, would have required a dedicated infrastructure. The graveguards are implied throughout the environment but rarely given explicit attention, which is appropriate. They are the maintenance crew of a civilization built on death, and maintenance crews are rarely celebrated. The powder keg hunter who drops the cannon is found in Old Yharnam with a group of beast enemies who have clearly overpowered the area where he stationed himself. He died holding a position that his weapon could not ultimately defend. The cannon is one of the most powerful weapons in the game for raw damage, but it requires a specific kind of resource to use repeatedly, and the implication is that he ran out. The specific detail of a powder keg hunter dying of resource exhaustion in a position that his enormous weapon had temporarily made defensible is a story told entirely through enemy placement and item drops, which is exactly how Bloodborne prefers to do things. The crowfeather set, which Valter wears and which the player inherits, has a description that mentions the sigil of the League. The League is described as an organisation of hunters who cooperate across the boundaries of individual hunt nights, maintaining connections through the dream. The mechanics of this in-game are summoning and co-op, but the lore implication is that the League exists as a social and institutional structure Outside of any single hunter's experience, Walter built something that outlasts him, a network of hunters bound by a shared practice of seeing and hunting the vermin. Whether the vermin are real or not, the network is real. The blindfold cap associated with the formless Uden is worn by characters who have devoted themselves to Uden service. The blindfold is not decorative. Udon, being formless, has no appearance to look for. Seeing is irrelevant to worshipping something that cannot be seen. The blindfold may represent the willingness to give up one sense in order to develop the ones that can actually perceive Uden: hearing, touch, the sense of presence. Or it may simply be a symbol of submission, a voluntary blinding in deference to something too large to be perceived anyway. The church attire worn by the base-level healing church workers is designed with practical considerations for working in an environment where blood is likely to be present in large quantities. The material resists staining and is treated to prevent absorption. This is the most mundane possible piece of lore in a game full of cosmic horror, and that mundanity is what makes it work. Someone designed a uniform for people who worked with holy blood. They had to think about laundry. The church was a bureaucracy with laundry problems. That is a kind of horror that lands differently from the great ones. The choir garb, which is the upper tier of church uniform, is made from material sourced from celestial beings, or so the description implies. It is lighter and more unusual than the lower church vestments, befitting an organization that spent significant time in the presence of ebrietas. Whether wearing the remnants of celestial creatures constitutes reverence or exploitation in the choir's theology is not addressed. They wore it. They kept using it. The line between devotion and appropriation was one the church never seemed to find important. The old hunter Henriette Phantom uses the Hunter of Hunters set and, in her phantom form, assists with specific boss fights in a way that suggests her history of fighting hunters has prepared her well for fighting bosses. The game does not explain this. It is just a thing that is true. Hunters who develop their skills hunting other hunters are often more effective against the game's major enemies than hunters who develop their skills hunting beasts. This is either a mechanical coincidence or a lore implication about the nature of what the bosses are and how similar they are to hunters in their danger profile. The Saw Hunter badge, which unlocks the earliest church weapon purchases, is found on a corpse in the hunter's dream. The specific placement of the badge in the dream, rather than the waking world, suggests that the hunter who carried it died there or was claimed by the dream. The hunter's dream contains remnants of hunters who came before, their memories and items stored in its space, which is why you can find so many items there that seem anachronistic or unexplained. The dream is an archive of hunts. Everything left behind by everyone who has ever been through it is still there, if you know where to look. The beast patients in the Healing Church clinic area, the ones who are still in hospital gowns and clearly very recently transformed, are the most directly tragic enemies in the game's early sections. They are people who came to Yharnam for healing, submitted to the church's care, and were transformed by what the church gave them. Their hospital gowns are a costume that communicates exactly what happened. They were patients. They went through the intake process. They received the blood. And then the night came, and what the blood did to them became visible. They are the human cost of Yharnam's medical industry, wearing their medical industry's clothing when you find them. The Healing Church physician, enemies who wear the distinctive white and gold outfit and carry ceremonial tools, were presumably people who administered blood ministration to patients. By the time you encounter them as enemies, they have been affected by the same processes they spent their careers administering. The transformation of the caregivers is one of the game's recurring ironies. The people responsible for the health of others are destroyed by the thing they used to maintain it. There is no clean position in Yharnam's system. Everyone who participates in it is exposed. Everyone who is exposed is eventually changed. The Nightmare Apostles, enemies found in the Nightmare of Mensis, are the final forms of the School of Mensis scholars. They move on the walls and ceilings, are fast and dangerous, and retain just enough of their original human shape to be recognizable if you know what you're looking for. The School of Mensis sought to ascend through direct contact with Murgo, and they succeeded in making contact. What they did not account for is that contact with a Great One does not elevate you. It unmakes you and remakes you as something that can survive the contact. Whether the apostles are happy with what they became is not something the game allows you to assess. Mikolash, the host of the Nightmare, is the last surviving member of the School of Mensis with anything resembling a coherent personality. He has become an academic of the Nightmare, studying it from the inside, chasing the connection with Kos that his school sought. He quotes the Byrgenwerth scholars. He references the formulas and theories that defined his education. He is delighted to be where he is, which is the most disturbing thing about him. The Nightmare is exactly what he wanted, and he got it, and it is killing him, and he is fine with that. The boss fight with him involves chasing him through a maze while he monologues, which is a deliberately absurd and darkly funny sequence that captures his character perfectly. The School of Mensis brain, the large structure floating in the Nightmare that is responsible for the red moon and the madness it causes, is described as a mass of human brains that contains the consciousnesses of the Mensis scholars. They uploaded themselves into a collective structure and then used that structure to reach into the Nightmare and make contact with Murgo. The physical object hanging in the Nightmare, the brain in a jar that emits the red moon's light, is the School of Mensis in its final form. They became a building material for their own ambition. The architects of the project are the project. The living failures, the failed transcendence experiments in the Healing Church Research Hall, who float in the air and attack with plant matter and starlight, are described as people who almost made it. They are beings who were given the eye treatments, who developed the early stages of transcendence, and who then stalled at that point without completing the process. They are permanently in between, human enough to remember what they were, transformed enough that what they were is no longer accessible. They cluster near the astral clock tower, the site where at least one person succeeded where they failed, and they spend eternity reaching for something they will never complete. Adeline's completion of the process, which produces a kind of lobotomized enlightenment, is presented with complete ambiguity. She gets what she wanted. Her head blooms into a flower. She is peaceful. She asks for one more dose of the substance that brought her to this state, and then she dies, presumably happily. Whether this constitutes a good outcome depends entirely on what you believe the alternative would have been. She was already a prisoner of the Church's experiments. She was already partially transformed by their treatments. What she achieved may be the only kind of freedom available to someone in her position. The game does not tell you what to feel about that. The Canehurst Vile Bloods, who remain in the castle, are technically undead, blood-sustained remnants of an aristocracy that was destroyed by the executioners. They fight with a specific kind of pride, as if the rules of their original social order still apply. The older noble enemies in particular fight with a formal technique that suggests the Canehurst tradition had its own combat culture, distinct from the church workshop tradition and from the Thumerian tradition. They are the remnants of a third approach to organised violence in Yharnam's world, and by the time you encounter them, they are ghosts of a lineage that effectively ended the night Ligarius arrived with his executioners. The Witch of Hemwick is an enemy and boss that occupies a strange position in the game's ecosystem. The witches are described as women who stole eyes from hunters, and they use those eyes in their rituals. They are not connected to the Great Ones in any obvious way, not to the church and not to the Chalice dungeon tradition. They represent an independent relationship with power in a game where almost every other faction is connected to the central institutions of Yharnam's history. the witches found a way to tap into the same general pool of strangeness without going through any of the official channels. What their ritual eyes actually do, what they enable, is not explained. They just use them. And the hunter who goes to Hemwick to recover the rune workshop, Tool finds only the witches and the things they have made from the eyes they collected. The Yahargal hunters, found in the unseen village, are some of the most dangerous human enemies in the game. They have been captured by the School of Mensis, which uses the village as a hunting ground for gathering bodies for its rituals, and some of them have been transformed or driven mad by exposure to the Mensis nightmare. The ones that are still somewhat coherent fight like experienced hunters who have lost their purpose and replaced it with aggression. They are technically still doing what hunters do. The context has just been stripped away entirely, leaving only the killing. The final note on the hunters of Yharnam is that none of them in the end succeeded at what they were supposed to be doing. The city fell anyway. The hunt produced more beasts than it stopped. The church's project failed, the Menzies project failed, the workshop's project failed, the executioner's project failed. The only people who arguably accomplished something are the ones who found a way out of the whole system, one way or another. Maria, who removed herself from it, Simon, who tried to end it, and the player character, who has the option, at the game's end, to either accept release, kill the moon presence, and become something new, or reject everything and wake up, leaving the dream behind. None of those are victories in a conventional sense. They are just the available exits from a situation that was never going to resolve neatly. Chapter 4. The Great Ones and the Cosmos. The Great Ones are the organizing principle of Bloodborne's cosmology, but they are not villains. This is an important distinction. The horror of Bloodborne does not come from the Great Ones being malevolent. It comes from them being indifferent, or at best interested in ways that do not align with what human well-being looks like. The contact between humans and Great Ones produces transformation, madness, and tragedy, not because the Great Ones intend harm, but because the difference between what they are and what humans are is too large to bridge without damage. Whedon is the Great One, most present in the lore, and the one with the least physical presence. It exists only in blood and in voice. Its tomb is beneath Yharnam's most significant religious site. It has worshippers who have organized their lives around a being they cannot see or hear in any conventional sense. And it is described as careless, reproducing prolifically, leaving traces of itself in the blood of its worshippers without apparent intention. Whedon does not choose to affect the people around it. It simply is what it is, and what it is bleeds into the people nearby. The celestial emissary is described as a representative of something beyond it. An emissary is a messenger, which implies a sender. Whatever the celestial emissary is representing does not appear in the game. The beings in white that cluster and combine to form the boss represent a chain of communication that the game only shows you the bottom of. Above the emissaries is something that the church was trying to reach through them, and above that is presumably whatever those beings were communicating with, and so on, in a chain that the game implies is very long and does not have a visible top. Ebrietta's, daughter of the cosmos, was left behind. The other Great Ones ascended, and Ebrietta's did not, for reasons that are not given. She was found by the choir in the Thumerian ruins and kept in the upper cathedral, where she has been studied and communed with, and used as a source of power for the church's more advanced operations. One reading is that she chose to stay, that she found something in her relationship with the choir that the ascending Great Ones did not offer. Another is that she was too damaged or incomplete to ascend, and the choir found her in a state of abandonment. Her boss fight has a phase where she buries her head in the ground, which some read as grief or shame, and that interpretation is hard to shake once you have seen it. The moon presence is the most directly antagonistic of the Great Ones, in the sense that it is the one whose agenda most clearly conflicts with the player's potential freedom. It established the hunter's dream as a mechanism for producing hunters, and it keeps Gehrman there as a caretaker against his will. Its appearance, pale and tentacled, arriving only when the red moon is brightest, suggests a being that exists in relationship with the moon in some way that other great ones do not. What it wants beyond the maintenance of the hunt is not stated. The final boss fight with it, if you consume the 3 umbilical cords, is the player character asserting independence from a system the moon presence built. Whether the moon presence understands this as rebellion or as something else is not clear. Kos or Cosm is the Great One found dead on the shore of the fishing hamlet. By the time you encounter her in the DLC, she has been dead for what appears to be a long time. Her body has been harvested. Her child is still clawing at her remains. The description of Kos is the closest the game comes to depicting a Great One as simply a natural creature, large and strange but not incomprehensible. She washed ashore, she died, she had a child. What happened to her before, and what she was doing in human waters, is not explained, but the simplicity of the fact of her death makes her the most human of the Great Ones in a certain way. She is the only one you meet who is clearly, definitely dead, and who is missed. The Orphan of Kos is one of the most visually striking beings in the game, a pale humanoid infant who fights with its own placenta. Its opening cutscene shows it clawing its way out of Kos's body and then screaming at the sky, and that scream is one of the most affecting sounds in a game full of disturbing sounds. It is angry. Whatever it is, whatever its consciousness consists of, it is angry in a way that reads immediately. The Orphan is not cosmic horror in the sense of being incomprehensible. It is cosmic horror in the sense of being a child whose parent was killed and who has been left alone in a world that killed her. That is a comprehensible horror. That is worse. The Great One's children are a recurring theme in the game. Whedon's children, Murgo, the Orphan, the umbilical cords, the celestial children in the upper ward. Something about the Great One's relationship with reproduction is central to how they interact with the human world. One reading is that the Great Ones reproduce instinctively, leaving offspring in the human realm the way certain species leave eggs in a host environment. Another is that they are trying to create something new, a bridge species, a being that can exist in both the cosmic and human registers simultaneously. The orphans and failed hybrids scattered across the game might be earlier attempts at this project. The player character, who has consumed enough umbilical cord material to be genuinely altered, might be the most successful attempt so far. The Great One Beast, a boss in the Chalice dungeons, is one of the rare cases where an entity is explicitly identified as a Great One, but is presented in a bestial form. This complicates the taxonomy. The beast condition in Yharnam, the transformation that the blood causes, is supposed to be a degeneration, a fall from potential transcendence into mindless animality. But if Great Ones can be beasts, or can take bestial forms, then the beast condition might not be simply a failure. It might be one of several possible transformations that contact with Great Ones can produce, depending on factors that are not fully explained. The wet nurse's black feathers and multi-armed form make it visually distinct from every other entity in the game. If you try to place it in the taxonomy of what Great Ones look like, it does not fit. The closest aesthetic is something like an angel of death in a non-Western tradition, a psychopomp, a figure that accompanies the transition between states rather than occupying any state itself. Whether the wet nurse is a Great One, a being made by a Great One, or something else entirely is not specified. Its function is clear, its nature is not. For Bloodborne, that is normal. The eye of a blood-drunk hunter, the item you use to enter the hunter's nightmare, is described as an eye that can see what others cannot. The blood-drunk hunter who possessed it could see the nightmare because their madness had opened a perceptual channel that sanity keeps closed. This is a variation on the game's broader theme of insight. Expanded perception comes at a cost. The cost in this case was a hunter's grip on reality. The reward was the ability to see and navigate a space that exists outside the normal waking world. Whether the trade was worth it is not the game's concern. It simply shows you the result. The fishing hamlet's Great One connection through Kos is the most domesticated version of the human Great One relationship in the game. The villagers did not try to exploit Kos. They built their spiritual practice around her presence, incorporated her into their understanding of the world, and continued fishing. It is the least apocalyptic version of what contact with a Great One can look like, and it was destroyed precisely because it was working too well. The Healing Church could not allow a model of coexistence that did not require church mediation to exist. Independent relationships with Great Ones threaten the Church's monopoly on transcendence. The Hunter's Nightmare reflects the actual nightmare that the fishing hamlet represents for the hunters involved. The architecture of the nightmare is Yharnam, but distorted, blood-drenched, eternal. The same buildings and streets, but wrong. The sky's always red. The enemies are hunters trapped in repetition. The nightmare is the guilt of what happened there, made physical and inescapable. The hunters who go there and cannot find the way out are living in a punishment constructed from the memory of what they did. The specific detail that the nightmare is architecturally Yharnam suggests the fishing. Hamlet's curse knows exactly where the people who hurt it came from and what to use to hurt them back. The amygdala is one of the most commonly seen Great Ones in the waking world, and their presence is tied to insight. With low insight, you cannot see them. As your insight increases, you can start to perceive them clinging to buildings throughout Yharnam. They are always there. They have always been there. What changes is your ability to see them. This is one of the game's most economical pieces of horror, using a mechanic to communicate something metaphysical. The world is full of things you cannot perceive because your mind is not yet open enough. That is not reassuring. The amygdala, who guards the nightmare frontier, is the first one you can interact with as a boss, and it grabs the player character with one of its many arms and holds them up for inspection before the fight begins. It seems to look at you. It seems to assess. Then it decides you're a problem, and the fight begins. Whether that assessment is the amygdala perceiving something about the player character that is unusual, or just a standard aggression response, is something you can take either way. The grab and pause is too specific to be accidental. It is doing something with that moment. What exactly, the game leaves open. The celestial mobs in Iosefka's clinic, the result of the imposter's experiments, have the general shape of the celestial emissary, but are clearly failed versions. They are smaller, less defined, and more aggressive than Ebretus or the emissary. They are the middle stages of a transformation that did not reach its intended endpoint. The imposter Iosefka's experiment was apparently trying to produce entities that could serve as emissaries or vessels in the same way the proper celestial beings do, and what she produced were approximations that had the form without the function. The trash at the bottom of the process of becoming a god. The Pthumerians, who had the longest sustained relationship with Great Ones of any human civilization in the game's history, developed practices that acknowledged what that relationship cost them. The chalice rituals, the elaborate preparations required to access the deepest dungeons, the specific materials needed, the specific ceremonies performed, suggest a tradition of managing danger as much as seeking power. The Pthumerians did not rush toward the Great Ones. They built protocols. They took precautions. They maintained the relationship over centuries with a care that the Healing Church never matched in its urgency to extract and exploit what the old civilization had managed carefully. The Canehurst Crow, the spectral transport that takes you to the castle, appears to respond to the invitation alone, not to any other credential. This suggests that Annalise, or whatever remains of the Canehurst infrastructure, has maintained some autonomous function even after the massacre that there is something still operating in the castle that recognizes the invitation and sends the transport. The crow is not an animal, it is something built or summoned, and its continued operation implies that the castle is not simply abandoned, but managed, in some minimal way, by something that is still there and still attentive to certain signals. The choir's experiments with ebrietas produced the 1/3 of umbilical cord found in the upper cathedral ward. The description of this cord suggests that it is the remnant of a contact between ebrietas and a human host, possibly a failed attempt to produce a Great One child in a human vessel. The Church's version of the umbilical cord project is one of the most explicitly reproductive horror elements in the game, and the fact that it produced a fragment rather than a complete cord suggests the project did not fully succeed. Ebrietas is still in the upper cathedral. Whatever she and the Church produced together was not what either of them were reaching for. The description of Great One children as stillborn appears more than once. Mergo is stillborn. The connection to Ebrietas's attempt may also be a stillbirth. The orphan of Kos, while alive, emerges from a dead mother. The Great One's relationship with reproduction in the human realm seems consistently to produce offspring that are compromised in some way, alive but wrong, powerful but incomplete. One reading is that the boundary between human and Great One is simply too large to cross cleanly in a single generation. The hybrids are always something between the two, never fully either. The amygdala's function in the lore is partially explained by a specific NPC, the Plain Doll, who mentions that the eyes on the inside of their palms are what allow them to perceive the player across the boundaries of the dream and the waking world. The Great Ones, through their extra eyes, can perceive things that exist across multiple states simultaneously. This is the same capacity that insight gives the player in a limited way. The Great Ones are not smarter than humans. They are more perceptive. They can see more of what is actually there. The tragedy is that what is actually there, fully perceived, is too much for a human mind to process without breaking. The Hunter Chief emblem, found in the cathedral ward, is a badge of authority within the church hierarchy. But by the time you pick it up, the authority structure it represents has completely collapsed. Nobody is left who it would mean anything to. It is an artifact of a system that no longer exists, carried by the player into situations that the system it came from could never have imagined. The game is full of this kind of item: credentials and authority tokens and membership badges for organizations that have ceased to function. Yharnam is a city of expired institutions. The Nightmare Lecture Building, reached through the Nightmare Frontier, is Byrgenwerth replicated in the Nightmare. The same building that started everything, where Master Philem sent his students underground and Lawrence first proposed blood ministration, exists as a nightmare duplicate where Mikolash resides. The significance of the building being replicated in the Nightmare is not explained, but one reading is that the Nightmare of the Hunters is rooted in the intellectual project of Byrgenwerth, that the nightmare began not in the fishing hamlet, but at the moment when the first scholar decided to go underground and take what he found there back to the surface. The lumen flowers in the research hall are connected to Adeline's transformation and to the broader project of inducing the third eye. They are a plant that responds to light in ways that suggest a relationship with the cosmic, with the sun or stars rather than the terrestrial. The research hall's environment is designed around light as a mechanism of transformation, and the flowers are part of that environment. They grow in a place of experiments and suffering and managed ascent, and they bloom regardless, which is either beautiful or indifferent depending on how you look at it. The dark beast Paarl is described as a beast composed of lightning, or as a beast so advanced in transformation that it has developed an elemental affinity. The taxonomy of what kinds of beasts are possible, what the upper range of transformation looks like, is explored through enemies like Paarl. It is a skeleton of a large beast wrapped in electrical discharge. barely physical anymore, existing in a state that is more energy than matter. Whatever it was before transformation is completely gone, replaced by something that is technically still a beast, but only barely still in the beast category. It is heading somewhere, and the direction it is heading is away from the material. The celestial lava, which is dropped by Murgo's wet nurse and used in specific rituals, is described as a being that was nearly a great one. Nearly. The gap between what it is and what it almost was is the entire tragedy of the Mensis project compressed into an item. The school of Mensis sought to produce something that could exist at the level of a great one. The larvae are the result of that attempt, beings that got close but did not arrive. They are used as materials for further attempts rather than recognized as individuals. The Mensis approach to nearly sapient beings is entirely consistent with how the Church approached people. The final interaction with any Great One in the game's base story is the Moon Presence fight, and it is worth noting that the Moon Presence does not fight immediately. It descends, it approaches. There is a moment before hostilities begin where it simply stands there, and if you have consumed the umbilical cords, you stand there too, and the game waits. That pause, that moment of mutual regard between whatever the player character is becoming and whatever the Moon Presence is the most direct communication between human and Great One in the entire game. Nothing is said. It ends in violence, but before that, there is a moment of recognition. What each party recognizes in the other is left entirely to interpretation. Chapter 5. The Forgotten and the Left Behind. Yharnam has layers of people who the main history of the game overlooks. The NPC questlines in Bloodborne are not presented as primary content. They happen in the margins of the main story, in alleys and locked rooms and side paths that the game does not point you toward. And the people in those questlines are the forgotten ones, not the church leaders or the hunters, whose legacies define the world, but the ordinary people trying to survive a night that was never their fault. The young girl who lives near the Udon Chapel is waiting for her father. She does not know that her father is Father Gascoigne, who has already transformed, who has already killed her mother. She is inside a house, alone, waiting. You can interact with her through a locked door at the beginning of the game and again later. What happens to her across the range of choices the game allows you to make is uniformly bad in different ways. She can end up in the sewer beneath the clinic. She can end up eaten by a mob. She can wander until something finds her. There is one outcome that is arguably best, which is finding her older sister, but even that requires specific actions that the game does not mark for you. The girl is waiting for a father who is already gone, and Bloodborne does not give her a clean way out. The Udon Chapel dweller is perhaps the most successful survivor in the game, simply by virtue of still being there, and still being sane when most of the night is over. He is eccentric and somewhat frightening, but he maintained the chapel as a sanctuary. He helped the people you sent there, and he did not transform or attack you. By Yharnam's standards, this is an extraordinary record. He did it through a combination of specific devotion to Udon and the fact that the chapel is a relatively sheltered space. He survived by staying put and doing his job. In a city where ambition and curiosity tend to be lethal, staying put and doing your job is a viable strategy. Iosefka herself, the real one, is heard only through a door at the beginning of the game. She is calm, professional, concerned for the people in her clinic, doing her best in a situation that is rapidly getting out of hand. By the time you can actually reach the clinic through its back entrance, she is gone, or transformed, replaced by the imposter. What happened to her, whether she was killed, transformed, or relocated, is not definitively established. The imposter's presence implies that whoever placed her there had access to the clinic and the time to replace the original doctor, which means the real Iosefka's fate was decided earlier in the night than the game makes clear. The imposter Iosefka is one of the more coldly villainous characters in the game, in the sense that she has clear goals, sufficient power to pursue them, and no apparent conflict about what she is doing to the patients she experiments on. She maintains the pretense of being a doctor, maintains Iosefka's manner and speech patterns, and uses the clinic as a cover for experimentation. When you confront her near the end of the game, she has already been transformed by her own experiments, and the transformation has not given her what she sought. She dies as a failed version of her own project. The symmetry between experimenter and experiment is one the game does not comment on. It just presents it. Ariana's background as a woman of pleasure in the cathedral ward and the subsequent revelation that she has Cainhurst blood does something interesting to the game's class dynamics. Cainhurst was the aristocracy, destroyed and buried by the church. Its survivors or descendants in the city live without that social power, reduced to whatever position the current system allows. Ariana's position is the system allocating her the least protected social role available. Her Cainhurst heritage, which under different circumstances would have been a mark of status, is something she either does not know about or cannot use. What happens to her at the end of the night, if you've been sending people to the correct shelter, is one of the game's more complicated images of survival. Adela's arc, which was touched on earlier, is worth returning to in the context of the forgotten. She is a blood saint, someone whose blood has particular spiritual value to the church, which makes her a resource in the church's accounting and a person in her own experience. The game never asks you to reconcile those two ways of seeing her, which is part of the point. She is terrified. She is dependent on the player's choices for her safety, and the church institution that assigned her value as a resource has completely failed to protect her on the night when the value of everything was being renegotiated. She is left holding a title that no longer provides protection. The wounded man in the sewers, who you can hear calling for help and who cannot be reached in time, is a background character who does not survive. He is there to establish that the city is full of people who are dying and whom you cannot save. Bloodborne is not a game where you can rescue everyone. It is a game where you make choices about who gets your attention and how, and the people you cannot reach or do not prioritize are simply lost. The game does not score you on this. It does not make you feel bad specifically. It just lets the moment exist, and if you notice it, it does its work. The Upper Cathedral Ward residents, before whatever happened to them happened, were a community of people drawn upward by the promise of the church's highest knowledge. The orphans who now wander the space were children who were subjected to experiments because the church decided that children's developing minds might be more receptive to celestial influence. The ethics of this, in the church's own moral framework, are never addressed by any surviving church document or NPC. The upper ward is just where the experiments happened, and the result of the experiments is docile child beings in white, who attack you if you get close enough, and the church does not appear anywhere in the upper ward to defend or explain what was done there. Patches the spider, found in the Nightmare Frontier, is a recurring From Software character who appears as a half-spider entity in this game, another victim or participant in the transformations that the cosmic contact of this world produces. He is recognizable to anyone who has played other From games, but his appearance here raises the question of what happened to him specifically in this world. What combination of blood and experiment and cosmic bad luck produced a man with too many legs? He maintains the Patch's personality, shifty and self-interested, and ultimately harmless, but the body he maintains it in is the body this game gave him. Damien of Mensis is an NPC found early in the Nightmare of Mensis, who seems reasonable, who speaks coherently, who gives you useful information. He is standing in the nightmare because of his connection to the School of Mensis, and he is one of the few Mensis-adjacent characters who seems to have retained both his form and his mind. How he managed this when his colleagues became brain matter in a jar is not explained. He exists as a point of contact in a space where most things have lost the ability to communicate. He is forgotten in the sense that his story has no resolution, no questline, no ending. He is just there, in the nightmare, knowing things, with nowhere to go. The church servants in the cathedral ward, who are hostile from the beginning, are wearing church uniforms and attacking anything that moves. They have not transformed into beasts. They are just violent, which is a subtle but important distinction. They chose this, or whatever the blood did to them produced aggression without physical transformation. The servants of the church who turned violent without bestializing represent a category of person who did not go all the way but went far enough to lose whatever was keeping them from hurting people. They are the middle of the spectrum, which in some ways is the most unsettling place to be. The Hemwick Charnel Lane enemies, the mad ones who shout and carry torches and work alongside the witches, are described as drawn to Hemwick for reasons they cannot fully articulate. They wanted eyes, they wanted to see more than they could. The witches offered them something. What they got instead of expanded sight was madness and servitude. The Hemwick area is one of the game's cleaner examples of what it looks like when people pursue the same goal as the church: expanded perception, expanded consciousness, by a route the church did not control, and fail in a way the church did not plan. The result is still failure. The route just did not go through an institution. The hunter nightmares trapped hunters are never given names. They are encountered as enemies, fighting with whatever weapons they had when they were pulled into the nightmare, moving through the same spaces in repetitive loops. They are defined entirely by their function. Hunters who could not stop hunting, who are condemned to continue indefinitely. The name you could give any of them does not matter. The nightmare stripped it away when it trapped them. They are the pure form of the hunter, the hunting without the person, and encountering them in the nightmare is the game showing you what the hunt looks like when you remove every other aspect of the person who used to do it. The doll is not forgotten, but she is excluded. She is the most constant presence in the game, always there in the workshop, always ready to help, and she is excluded from the waking world, excluded from the hunt, excluded from anything outside the dream. Her situation as a constructed being who cannot leave the space she was made for is a form of the forgetting that the game applies more broadly. She is the caring presence that the city of Yharnam eliminated from its own operations, the warmth that was moved into a dream so it would be out of the way. Lawrence's skull, found in the main game and used in the DLC to trigger the encounter with Lawrence the First Vicar, is one of the game's most physically strange boss encounters. Lawrence's spirit or memory or persistence is trapped in his skull, even after everything else is gone. When the skull is taken to the nightmare and placed, the encounter begins, and Lawrence rises as a beast, half human in his final form, still trying to speak, still reaching for something that is not there. The founder of the Healing Church, the man who convinced Yharnam that blood was salvation, died as the thing that he sold salvation from. His skull kept his failure for anyone who cared to find it. The Canehurst servants, who defend the castle, are the remnants of a court that was destroyed before most of the current crisis began. They are fighting for a cause that has been obsolete for years. They maintain their positions, their formations, their weapons, because the alternative is acknowledging that what they served is gone. The spectral nature of their existence allows them to avoid that acknowledgement indefinitely. They are the most literal version of the game's theme of inability to let go, ghosts still doing the job they had before they died, because stopping would mean accepting what stopping means. The fishing hamlet villagers, whom you do not encounter alive, are present only as the architecture of their destroyed village, the traps left behind by their curse, and the implication in everything the DLC tells you about what was done to them. They are the most completely forgotten people in the game, killed before the events of the night, buried under the weight of what came after, reduced to the source material of a nightmare that the people who killed them have to live in forever. The hamlet itself is a monument to them that functions as a punishment for their killers. It is not nothing, but it is not enough. The research hall patients who did not develop the third eye and who are not transformed into the living failures are simply patients. They are shuffling through the research hall in hospital gowns, reduced to something close to automatism, still alive in the biological sense but not in any other. The church used them. The experiments failed on them in the most ordinary possible way, and they are still there, still moving, still making sounds that might be communication or might just be noise. The game gives you no way to help them and no reason to think they want help from someone coming in from outside. They are the forgotten in the most literal sense, people whose names were erased by the process that was supposed to elevate them. The tomb prospectors, who are mentioned in item descriptions as people who explored the chalice dungeons for the healing church, did a job that was dangerous in ways the church did not fully disclose to them. They went into the dungeons, found what was there, and reported back. What the church did with what they found is documented throughout the game's lore. What happened to the prospectors is not. The nature of the dungeons, the enemies, the curses, the environmental hazards suggests that the casualty rate among tomb prospectors was not low. They are the unnamed labour force of the church's excavation project. Mentioned briefly and not returned to, the charred hunter set, found in old Yharnam, belongs to a hunter who was in the area when the church burned it. They either survived the fire or were preserved by it in some way, and the armour retains the burn damage permanently. The hunter who wore this set was there for the burning. What they thought about it, whether they were burning the district or being consumed by the effort to stop it, is not established. The armour exists as evidence that a person was there for the worst thing old Yharnam experienced, and then the armour is all that remained to tell you. Simon's bowblade is inherited if you complete his questline, and it is one of the most technically interesting weapons in the game, a bow that transforms into a short sword. Simon developed it for hunting in the Nightmare, where you need to be able to engage at range or in close quarters, depending on what you are facing. The weapon is a solution to a specific problem built by someone who had spent enough time in the Nightmare to understand what the problem was. The fact that it was made for the Nightmare makes it one of the few weapons in the game with a specifically Nightmare-adapted design. Simon thought practically about where he was and what he needed. The weapon is the evidence of that thinking. The powder keg badge that describes the rifle spear notes that the weapon was made for a hunter who needed to be able to engage large beasts at a distance and then close with them quickly. It is a transitional weapon, built for a specific moment in a fight. The powder keg philosophy of designing tools for specific tactical situations rather than general use produced weapons that are often impractical in the normal game, but that tell coherent stories about the problems they were designed to solve. Each powder keg weapon is a specific answer to a specific question, and the question is always some version of what do you do when the beast is larger than anything the existing weapons were made to handle. The blood gem system, which allows the player to modify weapons with dropped gems from enemies, implies that enemies carry within them traces of the transformations they underwent, and that those traces can be extracted and used to alter weapons. A beast's blood gem, applied to a weapon, makes the weapon more effective against certain things. You are using the beast's own transformation as a tool against transformation. The recursion is elegant and a little grim, and it is consistent with the game's general approach to the question of how you fight something when you're not sure what it is. The Vicar. Amelia fight, which takes place in the Grand Cathedral, and which ends with Amelia praying with her last strength, is the purest image of the game's central tragedy. Amelia was a leader of the Healing Church, a figure of genuine religious devotion, who transformed into the thing her institution was supposed to prevent. Her final act is prayer. She is still a true believer in the institution whose practices destroyed her. She reaches for the gold pendant that contains Willem's words about obtaining eyes, and she prays over it as she dies, which is either evidence of faith maintained even through horror, or evidence that the horror was not enough to break the conditioning. The game does not judge her for it, it just lets you watch. The grand cathedral is empty after Amelia's death. It is one of the grandest spaces in the game, and it becomes, after you clear it, just a room. You can walk through it. Nothing is happening there. The architecture still suggests awe and importance, but the institution it was built to house has collapsed, and what is left is just the building. Yharnam is full of this. Beautiful structures that are beautiful for reasons that no longer exist. The aesthetic memory of what the city was supposed to be, preserved in stone and glass, while everything the stone and glass was built to contain has dissolved. The note left by a pale blood researcher found early in the game is one of the first pieces of explicit text the player encounters and sets the tone for everything that follows. Someone came to Yharnam looking for pale blood. They found the hunt instead. They left a note that amounts to a warning written in the margins of a research document. The note is the trace of a person who did not survive what they came to find, reduced to a message that the game presents without context, without explaining who wrote it or what happened to them. They are the most completely forgotten person in the game. A handwriting and a warning. Nothing else. Chapter 6. What the endings say. Bloodborne has 3 endings, each of which arrives at the same final confrontation from a different angle and produces a different result. The game does not tell you which ending is correct. It does not tell you which one is good. It presents 3 conclusions to the same story and asks you to sit with what each one means. And the 3 meanings are different enough that they illuminate each other in ways that a single ending never could. The first ending, submitting to Gehrman, allows Gehrman to take your life and release you from the dream. You wake up in Yharnam at dawn. The city is battered and quiet. Birds are singing somewhere. The hunt is over for now, in the way it has always been over. The sun comes up and the survivors come out, and the church begins its next cycle of whatever comes next. You are dead. Gehrman returns to his chair. The doll tends the workshop. Everything continues. This ending is the one that accepts the system as given. You played the game, you did the thing, and you let the person in charge of the dream decide your fate. There is something to be said for the mercy of it, the simplicity. Gehrman was trying to be kind. The ending is quiet. The second ending, defeating Gehrman and being absorbed by the moon presence, produces the image of the player character lying in the workshop while the moon presence descends over them. The implication is that you have become the new Gehrman, the new caretaker of the dream, serving the same function for the next cycle of hunters. You defeated the previous occupant of the position and inherited it, which is a dark comedy of ambition. You refused the offered exit and fought for your freedom, and won, and the prize for winning is the same captivity, but with you in the chair instead. The ending is the longest running joke in the game, told without laughter. The third ending, consuming the umbilical cords and defeating the moon presence, produces something genuinely unprecedented. The player character becomes a great one, or something like one, or something adjacent to one, a small pale being cradled by the doll in the early light. This is the ending the game's lore points toward as the intended transcendence, the goal that the scholars and the church and the hunters were all reaching for without knowing how to reach it. Yeah, someone finally made it. The cost was everything the player character was before that moment. The being the doll is holding is not the person who arrived in Yharnam for blood ministration. It is something new. Whether that is a victory depends on whether you value what was there before. The doll's role in the third ending is significant. She is the one who receives whatever the player character has become. She holds the small thing gently and speaks to it as if it is precious, which reflects her fundamental nature, a being of care, made to support, finding something to care for in the moment the story ends. Her words are warm and accepting. She does not seem surprised. Whether she knew this was possible, whether the dream was always moving toward this moment, is not stated. She is simply there, and the thing that was a hunter is in her hands, and the sun is rising. The moon presence's defeat in the third ending raises the question of what the hunter's dream is now. The entity that maintained it is gone. Gehrman is presumably still in the chair. The doll is still in the workshop. Does the dream continue without its creator? Does it dissolve? Do the hunters who are being sent through it on subsequent hunt nights simply stop receiving assistance? The third ending closes on the image of the new being in the doll's hands and does not answer any of these questions, which is appropriate. The questions about what comes after are the questions the survivors have to live with. You are done asking questions. The burial blade, Gehrman's weapon, is available to the player after defeating him regardless of ending. The fact that his weapon is available to you after you have either accepted his mercy or rejected it says something about the game's attitude toward tools and their users. The weapon does not belong to the role. It belongs to whoever picks it up. Gehrman made it. You can use it. The history it carries does not change what it does in your hands, but it is still there, in the description, in the knowledge of where it came from. The sky in each ending is different. Submitting to Gehrman produces a clear dawn, normal light, the end of the nightmare. Defeating Gehrman without the cords produces the same sky, but with the moon presence descending into it. Defeating the moon presence produces a different kind of light, something that is not quite dawn, something that has the quality of a sky that has never been that colour before. The ending is announced by the sky before anything else, and if you pay attention to what the sky looks like in each case, the game has told you everything you need to know before the final image resolves. The plain doll's final dialogue in each ending is different. In the submission ending, she grieves. In the absorption ending, she does not appear. In the transcendence ending, she speaks to the new being with warmth and without grief. The doll, who is made of care, responds differently to each outcome based on what each outcome means for the person she has been caring for. She is the emotional register of the endings, the figure whose response tells you how to feel about what you have just done, which is generous of the game because it means you do not have to figure it out entirely alone. Gehrman's death animation, in the endings where you fight him, is one of the most carefully choreographed moments in the game. He is old, and he fights with a ferocity that the old man in the wheelchair did not prepare you for. When he is defeated, he falls the way an old man would fall, not dramatically, but with the specific weight of someone who has been going on willpower for a long time and has simply run out. He apologizes. He says something about the dream, and then he is still. The fight was supposed to be a gift, his offer to end things cleanly, and you refused, and now he is lying in the garden of the workshop he has tended for however long the dream has existed. The scene is beautiful and sad, and the game gives you a moment with it before the next thing happens. The cricket sounds in the hunter's dream are consistent throughout the game. Whatever is happening in Yharnam, whatever nightmare the hunt is producing, the crickets in the dream are constant. It is one of the most mundane details in a completely constructed space, and it is probably there because someone at From Software thought the dream should feel like a real place, with the ambient sounds of a real place. But it also has the effect of making the dream feel lived in, occupied for a long time, a space where even the insects have settled in. Something about the crickets surviving in a dream, maintained by a cosmic entity, is comforting and strange in equal measure. The hunter's dream will eventually have no one in it. Gehrman freed, or Gehrman dead, or Gehrman replaced. The doll remains in all versions, but the doll exists in relationship to others. Without hunters coming through, without Gehrman in the chair or whoever replaced him, the doll in an empty dream is an image the game implies without showing. She would tend the workshop. She would care for the lanterns and the graves. She would wait. Whether she is waiting for something or whether the waiting is simply her nature is one of the things about the doll that the game never resolves, and probably should not. The moon is the backdrop of everything in Bloodborne, appearing in different phases and colours throughout the night to mark the progression of events. The red moon in the nightmare, the full moon over Yharnam, the crescent over Cainhurst. The moon's behaviour through the night is a calendar of the hunt, charting stages that the hunters move through. The moon presence is associated with it, but the moon predates the moon presence in the way that all natural phenomena predate the entities associated with them. The moon was there before the hunt. It will be there after. The cosmic horror is real and present, but the moon's light is just the moon's light, indifferent and constant. The doll's graves in the hunter's dream, the small markers in the garden, are for hunters who did not make it back. She tends them, she maintains them. She gives the dead hunters of the dream a place in it, a marker, even if no one else knows their names. The graves are one of the details that make the doll feel real in a way that her construction should prevent. She cares for the dead because caring is what she is, even when the caring has no audience and serves no practical function. The graves are there. She tends them, that is enough. The final image of Bloodborne, in the Transcendence ending, is not a hero's arrival or a god's apotheosis. It is a small new thing in someone's hands, in the quiet after the fight, in a light that is not quite dawn. It is a beginning that looks like an ending, or an ending that looks like a beginning, and the game trusts you to know the difference, or at least to sit with the uncertainty. Bloodborne ends in an open question about what a thing becomes when it has finished becoming what it was. The answer, if there is one, is in that small pale being in the doll's hands, looking at a sky that has never been that colour before. You said, "Continue, continue, 1127. Claude responded, Chapter 7. The Architecture of Dread, Chapter 7. The Architecture of Dread. Yharnam's physical design is not decorative. The city was built with intention, and that intention is legible in the way streets connect, in which buildings tower over which others, in the specific relationship between the cathedral ward and the lower city that communicates hierarchy without a single word of dialogue. From Software's environmental design team created a city that tells its history through its construction, and learning to read that history is one of the quieter pleasures of spending time in the game. The central Yharnam layout funnels play us through a series of choke points that mirror the social structure of the city. The lower areas are cramped, cobblestoned, dark in the corners. The streets are the right width for a mob. As you move upward, toward the cathedral ward, the architecture opens. The columns get taller, the stairs get wider, the scale shifts to communicate that you're approaching somewhere that considered itself important. The city was designed so that moving through it physically produces the sensation of ascending a hierarchy. The lanterns that mark safe points in the game are placed at specific intervals in the world, and their placement is not random. Each one sits at a transition point, a place where you're about to move from one kind of space to another. The lantern at the top of the stairs before the cathedral ward is at the exact moment when the city's aesthetic shifts from residential to religious. The lanterns are a mechanic, but they are also waypoints that the level designers placed at moments of narrative and spatial transition, and the two functions reinforce each other. The sewer beneath the cathedral ward is one of the most uncomfortable spaces in the game, and it is uncomfortable in a way that is completely distinct from the horror of the streets above. The sewers are old, older than most of the buildings they run beneath, and the things that have accumulated in them are things that the city above has been discarding for a very long time. The giant pig enemies in the sewers are consuming something in the water, something that has been draining down from the streets above, and their size suggests they have been doing this for a while and finding it very nourishing. The sewers are where the city's waste goes. In Yharnam, the waste is particularly toxic. The Healing Church Workshop, the building where Gehrman trained hunters, is now sealed and inaccessible through the main entrance. You reach it through a side route, climbing up through areas that were not designed to be traversed in that direction. The approach to the workshop communicates something about its status. You have to go around to reach something that was once a central institution. It has been sidelined. Its main entrance is blocked. The church moved on and left the workshop behind, and the physical layout of the city shows you this without saying it. The top of the Healing Church workshop is the location where Yharnam's old summons can be found, the call that brings his memory into the dream with specific equipment. Reaching the top of the workshop is genuinely difficult, requiring careful navigation of a crumbling structure with dangerous drops. The game does not put a waypoint there. It does not tell you to go up. If you find what is at the top, it is because you decided the building was worth climbing, which means you are paying attention to the environment in a way the game rewards quietly and without fanfare. The Forbidden Woods' path structure is deliberately confusing. It is one of the few outdoor areas in the game, and it uses that openness to disorient in a way that the tight corridors of the city cannot. The trees obscure sightlines. The path doubles back. There are multiple routes that look like they lead somewhere and lead to dead ends, and multiple dead ends that contain something important if you are willing to push into them. The woods are a space designed around the experience of being lost, which is appropriate for an area that connects the surface city to the buried history it was built on top of. Byrgenwerth, when you finally reach it, is smaller than it should be. The university that started everything, the institution whose scholars went underground and found the old blood and sent half of them mad and the rest toward the founding of the Healing Church, is a single building. A large building, but a single building, surrounded by a courtyard and overlooking a lake. The scale is intimate in a way that is almost disappointing until you realize that the size of an institution does not have to match the size of its consequences. Byrgenwerth changed the world from one building and one lake, and a collection of scholars who could not stop asking questions. The lake itself, Lunarius, where Rom the vacuous spider resides, is one of the most visually distinctive locations in the game. The water is reflective in a way that feels wrong. Too still, too dark. Rom sits in the centre of it, surrounded by smaller spiders, doing something that the game's lore describes as maintaining the illusion that separates the waking world from the nightmare. Rom is not a villain. Rom is a mechanism, a being who achieved something like enlightenment and was assigned or drifted into the function of maintaining a barrier. Killing Rom is not a triumph. It is closer to removing a safety measure. The moment after Rom dies, the sky changes, the moon shifts, the red tint deepens. The world that you have been moving through snaps into a new configuration, and areas you have already visited have changed, filled with new enemies, marked by new signs of the events that were being suppressed by Rom's presence. The post-Rom world is the real Yharnam, the one that was always there, unfiltered. Everything before was a managed version. The city was worse than you saw. It was always worse. Yahar'gul, the unseen village, is one of the most oppressive locations in the game. The architecture is heavy, the streets narrow, the lighting sickly red after the shift. The school of Mensis used the village as a hunting ground for the bodies they needed for their ritual, and the traces of this are everywhere. There are cages, there are hooks. The church of the village has been repurposed into something that functions more like a slaughterhouse than a sanctuary. The unseen village is the most direct expression of what the Mensis project's practical operations look like in the physical world. The Nightmare of Mensis is architecturally related to Yharnam, but elevated and distorted in the way nightmares work. The same general structure, the same heavy stone, but the proportions are wrong. Things are larger than they should be, or smaller than they should be. The brain hangs in the sky where the moon should be. The nightmare does not try to be convincing. It does not try to look like a real place. It looks like a memory of a real place filtered through trauma, which is exactly what it is. The astral clock tower is accessible only through the nightmare of Mensis, which means you have to go through one nightmare to reach another. The clock tower sits above the research hall in both the waking world and the nightmare, suggesting that the nightmare architecture accurately mirrors the physical relationship between the two spaces. Maria's isolation in the clock tower is physical in both spaces simultaneously. She did not simply remove herself from the waking world. She removed herself from everything that the world contains, including its nightmare reflection. The depth of her withdrawal required her to go somewhere that neither version of the world could reach easily. The research hall itself is a medical facility that's been converted into something else without ever removing the medical furniture. The beds are still there. The examination tables are still there. The patients in hospital gowns are still there. Nothing has been cleared out to make room for what replaced the medicine. The experiments happened in the same space as the original care, using the same infrastructure among the same patients, which says something specific about how the conversion from treatment to experimentation happened. It was not a decision to start something new. It was a decision to use what was already there for a different purpose. The patients were already present. The equipment was already in place. Someone just changed what the equipment was for. The Lumen Flower Garden, reached by following the research hall's upper level to an outdoor space, is genuinely beautiful in a game that does not often aim for conventional beauty. The flowers are responding to the moonlight in a way that makes them glow softly, and the garden sits above the horror of the hall below with a specific indifference to what is happening underneath it. The beauty of the garden is the game showing you that the world contains beauty that persists alongside atrocity. The flowers are not beautiful because of what the hall is. They are beautiful despite it. That difference matters. The Hunter's Nightmares version of the Healing Church workshop is flooded with blood. Every surface is soaked. The architectural echo of the Waking World workshop, now rendered in blood, is the Nightmare's most direct statement about what the workshop's history actually was. The blood is what the workshop produced. The beautiful building in the dream, the practical space where hunters trained and weapons were made, is in the nightmare its true form, soaked through with the consequences of what hunting actually involved. The architecture is identical. The substance filling it is different. That is the nightmare's argument. The fishing hamlet's architecture is simpler than anything else in the game. Wooden structures built for weather and practicality rather than grandeur. Small boats pulled up on the shore, nets and tools visible everywhere. The contrast with Yharnam's Victorian Gothic is stark and deliberate. These were people with a different relationship to the world they lived in, one less interested in asserting dominance over the landscape, and more focused on working within it. The church hunters who arrived and destroyed the village brought the violence of a civilization that believed in conquest to a community that had not built its world around that value. The architectural contrast makes the massacre's cultural dimension legible without a word of dialogue. The cathedral ward's internal spaces, the rooms of the healing church that you pass through on the way to Vicar Amelia, are furnished with a specific kind of institutional Catholic Gothic: high ceilings, heavy wood, stained glass that filters the light into a dim, sanctified glow. The aesthetic is designed to produce awe and to communicate that whatever happens here happens under the auspices of something greater than the individuals involved. The healing church built its interior spaces to manage the emotional state of the people inside them, to keep them in a condition of reverence that made them receptive to what the church was offering. The architecture was doing pastoral work. The stained glass windows in the cathedral ward depict scenes that reward close attention. They show figures in attitudes of prayer or worship, reaching towards something above them. The figures being reached toward are not clearly human. They have the proportions and the suggestions of extra eyes that, in the game's visual language, mark great ones. The church is stained glass in its most sacred space, depicts great ones as the objects of worship. Whether this was always the case or whether the glass was made after the church's theology shifted in more esoteric directions is not stated, but someone commissioned those windows. Someone decided that was what the faithful should look at when they raised their eyes. The hidden path to Canehurst, accessed by taking a specific carriage ride that can only be initiated with the correct invitation, means that Canehurst exists as a parallel to the main city that the city cannot see. It is adjacent, it is connected by a road, but the road is only visible to people who have the right credential. The rest of Yharnam does not know Canehurst is there, or knows it only as the place the executioners went, as the place the heretics lived. The physical reality of the castle, still standing, still inhabited, is hidden from the city that destroyed it by a simple matter of access. The road exists, the invitation is specific. Without it, you could walk Yharnam for a lifetime and never find the entrance. The Chalice Dungeons. Beneath Yharnam are architecturally distinct from the surface in ways that communicate their age. The stone is heavier, the decoration is older in its conventions, less Gothic and more something that does not match any specific historical period, but feels genuinely ancient. The lighting sources are ancient torches and candles, and in some areas the glow from the blood itself, which provides a functional illumination that is disturbing because something that gives off light should not be what the blood is. The dungeons are a different country, architecturally, from everything above them. Going down into them is going somewhere that the surface city was built on top of rather than out of. The deepest Chalice dungeons have areas where the architecture gives way entirely to something that is not architecture in any recognizable sense, spaces that appear to be organic rather than constructed, as if the dungeon, at its deepest levels, is inside something rather than built as something. The transition from constructed space to what appears to be a massive biological interior is one of the more unsettling things in the game's environments, in part because it's gradual. You do not move from stone corridors to organic chambers in a single step. The stone becomes less regular. The organic elements increase, and then at some point you realize that what you're walking through is not a building anymore. The Hunter's Dreams Garden is one of the few genuinely peaceful spaces in the game, and its peace is maintained by the same entity that maintains the trap it is embedded in. The flowers, the graves, the workshop building, the soft light, all of it is constructed by the moon presence to make the dream feel like a refuge. And it does feel like a refuge. That is the most unsettling thing about it. The comfort is real, even though the construction is manipulative, and Yharnam has had to live with that specific combination for however long the dream has existed. The garden is beautiful. He made his peace with it a long time ago. It is still a prison. The area outside the Grand Cathedral, where Eileen can be found dying in one possible questline outcome, is a wide cobblestone space that during the main game feels like a transition area, somewhere you pass through to reach the cathedral itself. Finding Eileen there, injured, changes the space. It becomes the place where something happened, where the context you were not present for played out before you arrived. The space itself has not changed. Your relationship to it has. Bloodborne does this repeatedly, using areas you have already cleared and moved through as locations for later events, so that the geography of the city accumulates history as you move through it. The lamp in Iosefka's clinic, the first lamp you use in the game, is there when you return near the end. The clinic has been transformed by then, the patients turned into celestial failed experiments, the real doctor gone, the imposter present, and in the process of her own transformation. But the lamp is still there. The first place of safety in the game is still accessible in its location, still functional, in a space that has become completely different from what it was when you first used it. The persistence of the lamp through the clinic's transformation is one of the game's small continuities. Some things stay in place even when everything around them has changed. Old Yharnam can be observed from certain points in the main city. visible below as a burned-out lower level. The perspective from which you can see it is always slightly elevated, looking down. You never see old Yharnam from its own level while looking at the main city. The geometric relationship is one-directional. The living city can look down at what was burned. The burned city cannot look up at what replaced it. This is probably a function of level design practicality, but it has the effect of encoding the power relationship between the two parts of the city into the spatial experience of moving through it. The Forbidden Woods' hidden path to Bergenwerth goes through a cave system that connects to the lake. The cave is one of the only fully underground spaces in the main game that is not part of the sewers or the Chalice dungeon system, and it has a different quality from both. It is natural, or close to natural, in a game that tends toward constructed spaces. Moving through it feels like moving through something that was there before any of the human architecture around it, which makes the transition from the cave to the Bergenwerth courtyard particularly abrupt. You come out into the formal human space of the university from something that the university was built near, but did not build. The two gargoyle enemies on the roof of the cathedral ward are easily missed by players who do not look up. They are stationed at the ends of two buttresses that project from the main body of the building, and they watch the approach to the cathedral from positions that would have made sense as architectural features before they became mobile threats. The gargoyles in a traditional Gothic church are decorative and symbolic, guardians that cannot actually guard. In Yharnam, the gargoyles guard in the most direct possible way. The building's decorative elements have become functional. The metaphor has become literal. That literalization is consistent with the game's general approach to using Gothic conventions and taking them somewhere unexpected. The Witch of Hemwick's domain is a side area that connects to the main path at the Hemwick Charnel Lane, which is physically adjacent to Canehurst's entrance. The proximity of two locations associated with women with unusual power and unusual relationships to conventional Yharnam society is probably not symbolic in any deep sense, but it creates a geographic cluster of alternative power in a corner of the city that the church's main institutions do not occupy. Hemwick and Canehurst are on the margins in both the city's hierarchy and its physical layout, and both of them harbour something that the church would prefer to control. The unseen village's name is explained by a note that suggests the entire area was hidden from the city above by some means, possibly related to the mensis ritual, possibly to the bell-ringing women who appear throughout the area and whose bells maintain the connection to the nightmare. The village was present in the city's geography and absent from its awareness simultaneously, which required active maintenance. Someone was ringing the bells. Someone was maintaining whatever occultation kept the village unseen. The infrastructure of hiding an entire neighbourhood from a city required people who chose to participate in it, and those people are still there, ringing the bells when you arrive. The Pthumerian labyrinths, when generated through the Chalice ritual, produce spaces that are procedurally assembled from component pieces that are all drawn from the same pre-existing architectural vocabulary. The pieces are not randomly created. They are selected and arranged from a set of established forms. This means that every Chalice dungeon, regardless of how its specific rooms are configured, shares an aesthetic that is internally consistent. The dungeon you generate is different from any other dungeon you have generated, but it looks like the same civilization built it. The Pthumerians had a consistent architectural tradition, and the game honours that tradition even in procedurally generated content. The endgame nightmare areas, specifically the space where the final boss of the base game takes place, are set in the hunter's dream itself, but a version of it that is altered by the approach of something significant. The normally peaceful garden is the arena. The building is still there, the graves are still there. The fight happens in the place that has been your one constant refuge throughout the game, which is the final statement about what the dream was and who it belonged to. Your sanctuary was always the place where the final confrontation was going to happen. You were always being kept safe in the place where you would eventually have to fight for the right to leave. Chapter 8. Pieces the Game. Never explains. Bloodborne has a category of detail that it introduces and does not develop. Not mysteries that the lore resolves on close reading, but genuine gaps, things that point towards something and then stop pointing. This is either evidence of a design philosophy that trusts incompleteness, or evidence of content that did not make it into the final game, or both, and the distinction does not always matter as much as you might expect. The Master Villain seated in his rocking chair by Byrgenwerth's lake has eyes on the inside of his hands. He demonstrates this to you by holding them up if you approach him. He has achieved something, the evolutionary endpoint he was working toward, and it has reduced him to an almost entirely inert state. His consciousness has expanded in ways that have left his body behind. He can perceive things. He cannot act on anything he perceives. The specific tragedy of Willem is that he was right about what he was looking for and wrong about what finding it would mean for him as a person. He sits by his lake, hands up, eyes looking at things you cannot see, and that is all. The hunter's dream contains graves for hunters who died in the hunt. There are more graves than can be accounted for by any named character in the game. The dream has been running for long enough, and has processed enough hunters that the garden is substantially full of small stone markers. Each one is someone. Each one is a person the game did not have room to develop or name. The accumulation of unmarked graves is a number you cannot count, and a history you cannot access. The graves are evidence that the dream has been operating on a scale the game does not show you, and that scale is communicated only by the density of the markers in a garden that Gehrman tends alone. The doll was made from the memory of Lady Maria. The person who made her was Gehrman. The material of her construction is not specified. She is not stone, not automaton metal, not wood. She is something else, something that can be damaged and healed, that can speak and move and offer care in ways that are indistinguishable from genuine care, whatever genuine care consists of. The question of what the doll is made from, materially, is never answered, which is part of why her existence is so philosophically unsettling. She functions as a person. She is not described as a person. The game never commits to a position on the gap between those two things. The pale blood. The game introduces this term in its opening line and never resolves it. Theories have accumulated around it for the entire period since the game's release, each one compelling in some respects and failing in others. The most common readings are that pale blood is the moon presence, or that it is a specific blood type possessed by the player character that makes them unique in the world of the hunt, or that it is the concept of transcendence itself rather than a specific substance. None of these readings is definitively confirmed. The game uses the term once in its most prominent possible placement and then declines to explain it. This is either a profound choice or a loose end, and the game does not tell you which. The presence of patches in the Nightmare Frontier raises questions the game does not answer. He is half spider, which in the context of Bloodborne lore could be the result of many things: blood experimentation, the Umerian curse, cosmic contamination, or simply the accumulated consequence of whatever life Patches has lived across however many From Software games he appears in. He is not explained within the game's own framework. He is just there, recognizable if you know him from other games, inexplicable if you do not. His survival, in a form that should by rights be impossible, is one of the small miracles the game declines to account for. The suspicious beggar, one of the NPCs you can send to shelter, is harboring something. His item drops, when he eventually becomes an enemy, include beast blood pellets and the Crow Hunter badge, which belong to someone who was apparently already dead when the beggar arrived in Yharnam. What the beggar was before the night of the hunt, where he came from, and what he did with the hunter whose badge he carries are not explained. He presents as a victim. He is clearly something else. The gap between his performance and his reality is wide enough to drive several theories through, and the game provides enough material to speculate, but not enough to conclude. The Nightmare Frontier is described as a place where nightmares pool. It is not connected to any specific person or event in the way the hunter's nightmare is connected to the fishing hamlet massacre, or the nightmare of Mensis is connected to the School of Mensis ritual. It is a general accumulation of nightmare, a sump for the overflow of the dream world. The amygdala boss there, the amygdala who grabs and examines you, makes its home in this accumulation of nightmares. Whether it is native to that space, was drawn there, or created it, is not stated. The Nightmare Frontier is one of the game's most context-free spaces, which makes it feel genuinely alien in a way that even the other nightmares do not. The Celestial Emissary's stated function is to serve as a representative of something. The game is clear about this. What it is representing, to whom, for what purpose, is not stated. The upper cathedral contains Ebrietas, who is left behind by whatever the Celestial Emissaries were representing. The emissaries themselves are clearly not the main event in whatever cosmic process they are part of. They are functionaries, the nature of their function, the entity they serve, the purpose of the representation. These are all open. The boss fight with them is oddly anticlimactic given the title, which might be intentional. The representative is rarely as impressive as what it represents. The beast claw origin is described vaguely as belonging to a hunter who went so far down the path of beast transformation that the transformation left behind a weapon. The claws are described as having dried blood on them that cannot be cleaned, the same quality noted about the old hunter garb. They were someone's hands before they were a weapon. The specific identity of the hunter who left them behind is not given. They are just the terminal artifact of a person who became something else, and whose hands were all that survived the transformation in a form anyone else could use. The Cord of the Eye, the reward for reaching the highest level of the Insight Covenant, is an item whose description suggests it is a physical fragment of the mechanism by which Great Ones perceive the world. Carrying it grants insight. The specific origin of the cord which Great One it came from, under what circumstances it became a collectible item, is not established. It exists as a reward structure for a mechanic and as a piece of lore, but the two functions do not quite connect. Where does the messengers get this item? How does it come to be in the dream's economy? The dream has resources that its origins do not account for. The winter lanterns hum a specific melody. The melody is the same as the music box used to reach Gascoigne. This connection is noticed by players but not explained in the game's text. The music box was a gift from Gascoigne's wife, a lullaby. The winter lanterns are hunter-derived beings who have transformed beyond recognition into clusters of eyes and mouths. Why do they hum a lullaby? One reading connects them to the maternal or familial aspects of the blood, to the reproductive themes that run through the game's lore. Another reading is that the music is residual memory, that whatever they were before they transformed, they carried the lullaby with them into the transformation. The game presents the connection without explaining it. The lecture building exists in two places, as a waking world location, accessible from the Forbidden Woods, and as a nightmare location, accessible from the Nightmare of Mensis. The two versions are architectural duplicates. How the nightmare version came to exist, whether it was produced by the nightmare's tendency to replicate things, or whether the building itself somehow spans both spaces, is not addressed. The lecture building is the only regular waking world location that has a nightmare duplicate. Every other nightmare space is either a nightmare original or a distorted version of a waking location. The lecture building is perfectly replicated, which makes it stand out, even in a game that is not particularly interested in explaining its spatial logic. The Great One Beast in the Chalice Dungeons, the explicitly designated Great One, who is in a bestial form, raises the question of what the relationship between Great Ones and the bestial transformation actually is. The standard reading of the game's cosmology puts Great Ones and beasts on opposite ends of a spectrum, transcendence versus degeneration. But a Great One who is also a beast complicates that. Either the Great One fell somehow, devolved from its original state into something bestial, or the beast condition is not simply degeneration, or the taxonomy is wrong in ways the game has not fully worked out. The Great One Beast is one piece of lore that creates more questions than it resolves. The choir experimented with something called the eye of a blood-drunk hunter to enter the nightmare. The specific method, the specific person, the specific moment when someone thought to use a blood-drunk hunter's eye as a portal is not given. The result is that the DLC is accessible. The process that produced the result is summarized in a single item description. The gap between the summary and the full story is substantial, and the full story would be genuinely interesting, involving presumably a hunter who was both blood-drunk enough to perceive the nightmare and coherent enough to participate in an experiment about it. That person's story is implied and absent. The Mergo, who cries in the Nightmare of Mensis, is described as stillborn, yet cries. Stillborn means born dead, or born too early to survive. Mergo is crying. The contradiction is either a translation issue, or it is deliberate, or it points towards something about Great Ones and death that does not map onto human categories. A Great One could be both dead in the human sense and alive in some other sense simultaneously. The crying could be an echo of a consciousness that has not finished dissolving, rather than evidence of current awareness. The game offers the contradiction and leaves you to do what you want with it. The Canehurst Vile Blood's project of accumulating blood, under Annalise's direction, has no stated endpoint. She collects blood dregs. She sits on her throne. She waits. For what? The Vile Blood Covenant offers rewards for bringing her blood, and the description of those rewards suggests a process that is progressing towards something, but the something is not described. Annalise's plan for what she will do when she has enough blood, or what enough looks like, is one of the game's genuinely open threads. She is clearly patient. She has been alive long enough to be very patient. But patience implies an expected outcome, and the outcome she is patiently moving toward is not shown. The doll's memories of Lady Maria are fragmented and non-linear. She refers to Maria in terms that are affectionate, that suggest a connection that is deeper than simply being made in her image. What the doll actually retains of Maria's consciousness, if anything, whether the act of constructing the doll involves some transfer of memory or character from the original person, is not stated. The doll is clearly not Maria, but she is clearly not entirely separate from Maria either. The nature of what was transferred in her construction, the degree to which she carries something of the person she was modelled on, is one of the game's most intimate, unanswered questions. The League's vermin, the things that only certain hunters can see infesting other people, have a relationship to the game's broader cosmology that is not mapped out. Are they related to the Great Ones? Are they a consequence of the blood? Are they something that has always been present in human beings and that only specific kinds of perceptual expansion reveal? Walter's theory is that they are a corruption, something that should be hunted and removed. His theory may be right, it may be a projection. The vermin may be neutral, or even beneficial, or meaningless. The game provides a mechanic and a character with a strong opinion and does not provide a resolution. The Sinister Bell and the Beckoning Bell, the co-op and invasion mechanics, are explained in lore terms as tools used by the messenger creatures to allow hunters to call for help or to be pulled into other hunters' dreams. The messenger's social structure, their relationship to the moon presence, the nature of their loyalty to the hunt, and the specifics of how they enable the bell mechanics to work are completely unaddressed. The messengers are adorable and omnipresent and fundamentally unexplained. They live in the sewers. They provide services. They wear little hats if you give them clothing items. What they are, in the cosmological sense, is one of the most cheerfully unresolved questions in the game. The formless Udin's children, scattered throughout Yharnam in the bodies of the worshippers who have been unknowingly carrying his influence, are described in the lore of the Uiden rune as remnants of the Great One's careless reproduction. The scale of Uadin's reproductive activity, the extent to which the citizens of Yharnam have been affected by proximity to his tomb and his blood, is not quantified. How many people in Yharnam are carrying some trace of Udin? Is it everyone who received blood ministration? Everyone who lived near the tomb? Everyone who ever visited Yharnam? The reach of Udin's influence is suggested to be very large and left unspecified, which makes it feel larger than any specific number would. The specific nature of the blood transfusion in the opening scene, the nature of the contract signed, and the identity of the mysterious figure who performs the transfusion are all presented and not explained. The figure seems to know what is going to happen to the player character. The contract seems to be more than a standard medical consent form. The transfusion seems to be a specific act with specific intent rather than a general blood ministration. The opening scene is the most deliberately obscured moment in a game full of deliberate obscurity, and it remains so through multiple playthroughs and multiple endings. Whatever the figure was, whatever was agreed to, it was the real beginning of everything, and the game does not tell you what it was. The final unanswered question, which is the one that sits under all the others, is what Yharnam was before it started reaching, before the Pithumerians went underground, before the scholars went into the dungeons, before the blood, the church, the hunt, the nightmare. The world the game takes place in has a deep history, and the earliest part of that history, the world before the Great Ones made contact, is entirely outside what the game shows or suggests. What was there before the reaching started is the one question that has no lore fragment to point toward an answer, because the lore begins at the moment of the reaching and does not look back further. You said, continue, 1140. Claude responded, Chapter 9. The language of blood, Chapter 9. The language of blood. Bloodborne communicates through its item descriptions in a way that rewards a specific kind of reading. The descriptions are short, dense, and written in a register that is somewhere between clinical and poetic, never fully one or the other. Learning to read them means learning to extract information from language that is designed to feel like partial revelation, like you are reading the summary of a document you will never see in full. The descriptions are the game's primary literary form, and they are very good at what they do. The tonal consistency across item descriptions suggests a single sensibility behind them, or a very disciplined editorial process. Every description in the game sounds like it was written by the same person, or by people who had internalized the same set of constraints. Short sentences, specific nouns, verbs that carry weight. The occasional phrase that is stranger than the surrounding language, that opens onto something the rest of the sentence does not explain. The consistency is a form of world building in itself, a suggestion that the world has a coherent texture that extends into its documentation. The pebbles item description reads in translation that hunters use pebbles to distract enemies, but that the pebbles found in Yharnam are of a particular quality, dense with something unspecified. The joke in the pebble description, if it is a joke, is that the game applies the same descriptive weight to its most trivial item that it applies to its most cosmically significant ones. The pebble receives the same treatment as the living string. Everything in Yharnam is documented with the same earnestness. The world does not distinguish between the important and the mundane in its record keeping, and that indiscriminacy is part of what makes the record feel real. The hunter's arsenal items, the knives and pebbles and molotovs and oil urns, are the only items in the game described in entirely practical terms, without cosmic or historical weight. They are tools. They do specific things. The descriptions tell you what they do. This is the game's acknowledgement that not everything in the world of Bloodborne has a lore implication. Some things are just rocks. Some things are just fire. The presence of these purely practical items among the cosmically loaded ones makes both categories more effective. The Molotov means more as a mundane object because it sits next to the umbilical cord. The blood vial description is one of the most frequently read item descriptions in the game, given how often players interact with it. It reads in compressed form as a description of a medical product. Blood from Yharnam used to restore health through a process of rapid self-ministration. The language is that of a pharmaceutical product. Clinical, matter-of-fact, slightly euphemistic about what it is actually doing to the person using it. Injecting yourself with blood from an unknown source is described in the same register as taking a prescribed medication. The language normalizes what should be alarming, which mirrors exactly how the healing church operated in practice. The quicksilver bullets are made from the hunter's own blood, transformed into a solid projectile. The description is brief and states this as a fact without comment. You are literally shooting pieces of yourself at enemies. The mechanic is elegant in its economy, a resource that regenerates because it comes from you, that costs you a small fraction of your health to use. But the description of what the bullets actually are is delivered in the same flat register as everything else, which means if you're reading quickly, you might miss what it said. The game frequently buries its most disturbing details in the middle of descriptions that sound routine.